And in fact, the Russian thinkers of the 19th century could have been interchanged with Prussian or French or any other thinkers in the West. They were thinking just the same thing. And they were possibly even just a little bit nicer, because you had three there, Genrikh Antonovich Lehr, then Anton Antonovich Krasnovsky, and then later in the 20th century, Evgeny Edvardovich Nesner, and all three of them said, ooh, it would be nice to have peace. Peace should really be the natural condition of relations between mankind, but in fact, it's not. We will only have eternal peace when mankind has died out, or even struggle for existence is God-given. So in fact, they were social Darwinists like everybody else, even if occasionally they showed little sparks of thinking, oh, it would be nice to have peace. And here is a nice little quotation from Putin speaking at the World Economic Forum in 2020, in which he said, "We all know that competition and rivalry between countries in world history never stopped, will not stop, and will never stop. Differences and a clash of interests are also natural for such a complicated body as human civilization." So there is the basic assumption of competition, conflict, and not of cooperation. There is a very interesting observation from a Prussian officer who was a contemporary of Karl von Clausewitz in the promotion in which Karl von Clausewitz was at his own military academy. So I think that is appropriate for a military academy. And his name was Otto August Rühle von Lilienstern. And he found, even in the times of the Napoleonic Wars, that there are not just contexts of interstate wars, but he said there are other contexts in which a state derives some substantial or perhaps only imaginary gains from the continuation of war. He realized that there are in fact states to profit from ongoing war. In such cases, said he, war is by no means waged for the sake of peace, as this would be a quite undesired event, but for the sake of the hoped-for gains to be achieved by ongoing war. Such wars include those that are waged for passion and for personal interests of individuals, in short, because of some subordinate interest, but not the interest of the general welfare of the state. Let us turn to the second tradition that obviously I much prefer, that of peace being the norm, one which we now much prefer today. Curiously, this also goes back to Plato and ancient Greece. Plato thought that one should, on the whole, legislate for the sake of peace, not of war. Even in the Roman idea of the Pax Romana, you see the idea of peace being the thing that you wanted to have at all times. Fast forward to the 20th century, when you had the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created after the First World War in order to bring about international peace, lasting international peace. That was the hope of the founders of the League of Nations. And of course, we have a charter idea that that the United Nations Charter was created to relieve future generations from the scourge of war. But interestingly, this tradition that sees peace as the norm, was not always reflected in peace treaties. Just to go through very, very quickly, peace treaties in antiquity were always limited in time. This is why we talk about a truce between Athens and Sparta, a truce because they were limited in time, they were not perpetual. In the Middle Ages, there were even times when it was thought that a peace treaty expired if one of the signatories died. So if one of the signatories died, his successor, or her successor, had to make a new peace agreement to continue the state of peace. It is really only from early modern times, from the 16th century, that we have a tradition of aiming for perpetual peace. So the idea of a perpetual peace is indeed something that is quite recent. In various religious traditions, peace is seen as a very distant finality. So in the Hebrew tradition, you have this idea that one day at the end of time, swords will be turned into plowshares and all that. And Christianity and Islam also see peace as a sort of end state in many ways, something that we also find in Marxism-Leninism, which is very much a derivative from Judaism and from Christianity, where peace is seen as an end state, but everything up to there is struggle. It is also very interesting to see that Islam, in theory at least, completely rules out a peace between Islam or Islamic entities and non-Muslims. So for centuries there were treaties that were always, again, limited in time so that they could be called truces, because the Quran allows truces but not peace treaties. It is only from 1699 that the Ottoman Empire abandoned that attitude, and people talk about this Treaty of Karlowitz being the moment where the Ottoman Empire entered into the Western family of nations, because for the first time the Ottoman Empire signed a treaty which again was seen as a perpetual peace. Another thing that is directly connected with our views of peace being the norm or peace being something that can be achieved is that there is a Western faith in progress. The idea that there is a linear development of history in which we learn from past mistakes and become ever better at organizing the world in international relations with international norms so as to be able to ban war, to banish war. This is very clearly the thinking of the authors of the League of Nations Covenant and of the UN Charter. This view of linearity, in Britain often referred to as the Whig view of history, however, is not shared by many other cultures which see history as something cyclical, something that comes back. You have this Chinese view of yin and yang, you have a Buddhist idea of the cycle of life, where there is no direct belief in progress and finality, but something where war can be a cyclical thing that comes back. Let us turn to this idea of trying to make war short and sharp. The quotation that I have comes directly from Frederick II of Prussia, who said that he wanted his wars to be short and sharp, but alas, he didn't quite manage. His wars lasted between 1 and 7.8 years. But it's interesting, my late colleague from the University of Reading, Colin Gray, an Anglo-American historian, said that one of the key characteristics of the way in which the West goes to war, engages in wars of intervention or whatever it is now, is to, from the word go, from the beginning, to be thinking of an exit strategy. Always to hope that this could be a very short intervention. And I remember a wonderful quotation from Paul Nitze, who once said that this idea of a surgical strike, which seems to be an ideal for Western military interventions, he said in his experience was something that was quite unrealistic, that because what he'd experienced as surgery was usually, it was very invasive, and usually you had to come back for more. So he clearly had some horrible hospital experiences of this. So we have this curious idea that we have an idea that is particular to our culture. I'm not saying we shouldn't have it, but this is our ideal, that there should be a clear-cut end state that should be reached as soon as possible. And we have this idea, this obsession with strategy being about ends, ways and means, etc. Whereas this is, again, not necessarily something that is shared by our adversaries. Let me remind you of the quotation of Otto August Rühle von Lilienstern, who said that for some people, for some leaders, war may be something very profitable. They may not have an interest in ending it soon because they profit from the ongoing war. And the reality of war as we know it is that you tend to have a full spectrum of different military activities, which are much more like various police activities, all the way from police activities to something that can include crime and everything else. You know the expression of my Israeli colleagues, Eitan Shamir and Ephraim Imbar, who talked about how this means mowing the grass, that you have to come back for more, that you have to assume in many contexts that whatever you're fighting will not go away, but will grow back even after you've tried to crush it and defeat it. I think a very relevant metaphor in the context of fighting drug gangs and organized criminal crime. So you have things to do, or you have police actions that go all the way from issuing parking tickets and keeping civil orders to the full spectrum of things that you do to pacify areas, to in fact war against a state's armed forces. And you see that the red circle would be describing military activities, the blue circle would be describing police activities, and from what I understand, not only in your country, but in other countries of Latin America, particularly towards the north of Latin America, there is an awful lot of overlap now between the fighting that has to be done in the context of fighting drug cartels and criminal gangs, overlap between police activities and the armed forces activities. Let me move forward to the issue, the subject of decisive victory. Victory is something that is triumphal, that builds national identity, that is drawn upon in order to commemorate past glory and inspire future generations. But this Western idea of a decisive battle and victory is something that is not fully representative of reality. So here this picture of Napoleon triumphantly marching through Berlin and celebrating his victory over the Prussian forces in 1806 is not something that then led to a perpetual peace, particularly as Napoleon was not very good at making perpetual peace. The norm for most of European history and world history is in fact that there is a long-term constant strife and not something that is clearly divisible into war versus peace. Decisive battles, well, an awful lot of battles that are decisive in one way or bring one side out as a victor can be reversed in future battles. So when Napoleon marched through Berlin, he created the resentment of a lot of the population who were then willing to organize themselves for a big counter-campaign, at the very end of which stood the battles of Leipzig and then Waterloo. If you look at history, there have been 1,000 years of Persian wars with their Western neighbors, Greeks and Romans, and while one time it was the Greeks and the Romans who won, and another time it was the Persians who won, then the kind of conflict continued. You had 1,300 potentially plus years of Islamic expansion into Christian territory. Even setbacks for the Islamic forces could then be reversed and expansion could continue. Keeping invasions and raids at bay was something which was much more the common, the default option for many countries, rather than thinking that they would succeed at some stage. And I've already talked about the mowing the grass metaphor. A very, very interesting quotation can be found in a fantastic film, which if you haven't seen it yet, I strongly recommend, which is the Israeli film, The Gatekeepers, in which an Israeli general who used to run the Shin Bet organization, the counter-terrorist organization, talked about a peace activist, a Palestinian peace activist, Ayad al-Serraj, who said to him after a second intifada, "We have defeated you." Upon which he said, "How have you defeated us?" And Ayad al-Serraj said, "Our victory is to see you suffer." So if you define victory quite differently from the triumphal march of Napoleon through the defeated capital, and simply define it as the achievement of your aim that your adversary can never come to rest, then this is a quite different definition of victory, and the other side may have it, and that might be the aim. I have already talked about the centrality of battles and how in our imagination of war, battles take up this really, really big place, when in fact wars against civilians, wars affect civilians in so many ways and are quite unheroic, whereas battle is celebrated as something heroic. So it's quite interesting how few illustrations there are of the cruelties affected against civilians in warfare, and it's also quite interesting how late it was in the history of Europe that people began to care about civilians. Again, let me turn to these amazing 5 American writers who, writing in 1989, were very prescient about future developments, Lind, Nightingale, Schmidt, Sutton and Wilson, who thought then that in future wars the distinction that we labored for such a long time in the West to create in international humanitarian war between civilians and combatants, as they said, may disappear or may be more and more fudged. And if you think of the 20th century, there have been so many wars despite international humanitarian law that greatly, greatly affected civilians, whether this was by bombardment or whether by rounding up minorities and putting them in concentration camps and murdering them there, or whatever it was. Civilians have suffered massively. So this idea that there's this nice, neat distinction has really been very much challenged even in the 20th and 21st centuries. And again, let us turn to Ben Barry and his comments on his experience of the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars. For Iraq, he said, after the defeat of Saddam's regime, most combat in Iraq was in the towns and cities, reflecting the political importance of the settlements where most of the Iraqi people lived. Afghanistan was a much less urbanized nation, but combat still revolved around towns, villages, and farm compounds. And when that is the case, it is very, very difficult to spare civilians and make a neat distinction, because there will be collateral damage. Let me turn now, on my 6th point, to the differences between Western ideas of binaries and dialectics and Eastern ideas, or those of some other cultures that we are dealing with. Binaries, what I mean is to think of the world in terms of good and evil. Now, interestingly, you've all come across this, I'm telling you nothing new there, in the Chinese, Korean, other Eastern, yin and yang thinking, there is an element of one in the other. They're not as mutually exclusive as we think of them. And there's, of course, the circular idea that one or the other will come back. And I see there is a representative here from Korea. I hope that he can sort us out if he has anything to add to that and an explanation. But I think it is important for us to realize that there are other cultures that don't think in the same binaries. We use these binaries a lot for a good purpose. We need them particularly for international law. And in international law, you really need to know whether the laws of war apply or the laws of peace apply. And therefore, there is some sense that it is not that we've just stupidly created this binary, but we do need to use it for international law. We also think of wars, and that's where it becomes less intelligent, in terms of victory and defeat. And as I've just explained when I was saying that you can see victory in completely different ways, it is not necessarily totally a question of victory and defeat. You may find that a party that has been nominally defeated in fact has gained something from the war that the other side had not intended at all. Going back to international law, we do try to distinguish between combatants and civilians, a good thing, yet there are categories in between that we find extremely difficult to handle. So this is particularly reflected in the binary of regular soldiers versus rebels. The point about them being that soldiers are protected by the jus in bello, by international humanitarian laws, rebels only belatedly if they have a political cause. But where are we with Wagner? Where are we with mercenaries that are unaccountable? Where do we stand with military forces that in some way have no political aim but have only lucre as their aim? But also in a way in where I think in military academies we're making a mistake, and this is simply because we have to create a good overall plan. I know that Admiral de Carpio has been very active in reordering the syllabus of the Naval Academy here, and we do have to say, you know, this week it's that and another week it's that. But we tend to overclassify when we say, in fact, there is proper classical major war between states, and then there is irregular insurgency, rebellion. And looking at the syllabus, the syllabi that I have helped write, we tend to have this pigeonholing. We tend to say, you know, there is small war and then there is major war. There is limited war and there is unlimited war. There is irregular war, there is regular war. If you think about it though, even just think about the Second World War. You had all of these things coinciding, happening in parallel at the same time. And I think that's true for quite a number of other wars as well. By excessively pigeonholing, we prevent ourselves from seeing that one war can become something else. It may start at one thing, become something else, and it may also simultaneously take on different characteristics, be in different categories. And I find this very interesting. I don't know whether you saw that I limp very much, but I've also found that there is a lovely analogy between Eastern medicine and the way in which we tackle medicine. Whenever I go and see somebody about my various skeletal ailments, they will say, you see a knee specialist. Oh, no, that's not me. No, your hip is not my cup of tea. Whereas, so we divide the body into different bits in a similar way. We try to categorize and pigeonhole. Whereas I am told Chinese medicine, Far Eastern medicine, looks at the body in a much more holistic way. And I think we would do well to look at war in a more holistic way, rather than to say, your knee is for this particular specialist and your hip is for that specialist, and I can't dream of the two of them happening at the same time. So let us open our minds to this question of how we deal with regular combatants, rebels and mercenaries, and I'll just remind you that international humanitarian law covers insurgents and rebels, but not mercenaries, and that there is a big area to be defined, particularly as we are dealing with now more and more mercenary companies, and that this whole Wagner stuff, but not only Wagner, but other little subgroups, are really out there to plague us. General Rupert Smith also emphasized how important it is in many conflicts, when there is an ideological element of it, that there is a group of people, there is potentially the largest group of people, which doesn't necessarily fit into our definitions of, again, friend and foe. We have this strong idea that comes from the New Testament, where he said, "He who is not with me is against me," and which, because of this idea that there's only two possibilities, we tend to be blind to situations which are much more complex. So even in the 1930s and in the Second World War, an awful lot of people had trouble with the fact that we had a tripolar system where you had communism, Western democracy, and fascism. And those were three things. And could you ally with one against the other? Were you allying with the devil against Beelzebub? Which one was to choose? And that confused lots of people, to the point where Putin manages to confuse lots of people today by claiming that because the Ukrainians, wanting liberty, in the Second World War and thereafter, temporarily allied themselves with the Wehrmacht, Nazi Germany, those today in Ukraine who are resisting Russian occupation are all fascists. Yeah, if you have a binary world, then anybody who's against you must therefore be fascist. So we have so in the Cold War we had the problem with the non-aligned states. At the moment you see another tendency to try to push everybody into an alignment of either the BRICS or the West and its allies, and we have a conceptual problem with non-alignment and other states. And even in the detail of war, General Sir Rupert Smith very nicely put it that there was, in fact, we're fighting amongst the people, but we don't know where their sympathies lie. They may be completely neutral. We need to keep them out of the fire line. But it's still, there's still some ambiguity about this, and this is incredibly difficult for us to sort out. We have this idea of thesis and antithesis in Western thinking, whereas, from what I understand, Chinese dialectics has seen much more of a continuity between the two, or of a vague line between the two of them. Let me just go forward to a particularly widely cited work by two Chinese colonels who wrote about the unrestricted and beyond the limits war. I'm sure that that's a very bad translation of whatever the Chinese term is, because what they tried to talk about was war that does not fit Western definitions, Western ideas of binaries. And here a quotation from that book that is useful. In the postmodern, post-industrial age, warfare has reinvaded society in a more complex, more extensive, more concealed, and more subtle manner, using all means, including armed force or non-armed force, military and non-military, and lethal and non-lethal means to compel the enemy to accept one's interests. And I'm sure that the last line should actually be to compel the enemy to do our will, and then it would be a direct quotation from Clausewitz, of course. There's an interesting, I hope you can follow me on this, because this is sort of a double negative quotation. When Stalin was criticized for the first time and his great authority was challenged for the first time, in the late 1950s, Mao Zedong rallied to this, and he rejected Stalin's teaching. He criticized Stalin in the late 1950s by saying that Stalin had claimed that there was war and there was peace and nothing in between, when in fact Mao Zedong said that fighting in times of peace is politics. Look at the last line there. Fighting in times of peace is politics. War is also politics, even if it uses special means. So Mao Zedong's approach was to say that in fact there are fighting continues across a spectrum of war and peace. You can't simply divide it like that. And he interpreted Clausewitz and Lenin as saying that struggle takes place in war and peace with different tools, including non-kinetic ones. So let us keep that in mind, compared with all these Western binaries, where clearly other countries that we are dealing with do not have this neat division, this sharp division. And the Chinese approach clearly seems to be to mix as appropriate. Again, let me turn to the two colonels. Regardless of whether the war was 3,000 years ago or at the end of the 20th century, it seems that all of the victories display one common phenomenon. The winner is the one who combined well. And let us think of warfare much more as something that could be seen in the whole, as combining different tools as appropriate to that situation. So, I'll finish now with the seventh point, which is the massive amount of jargon that is produced by international relations theory. And I think that is very, very unhelpful, because what we really need to strive for is to understand our enemy. What's happening in the Western social sciences and in universities throughout the West is that theories go on and on about, particularly jargon approaches, about theories that are extracted from some examples and then applied universally as though you could do that. Whereas the whole approach of other countries is to say, you should know your enemy as you know yourself. And I think what you find is that there's far more interest, there always has been far more interest from what I can tell, on the side of the Soviets, on the side of the Russians now, on the side of the Chinese, in what we are doing, how we think, and where our weaknesses lie, and how they can be exploited, than we have shown vis-à-vis the adversary. I'm a real specialist on nuclear strategy in the Cold War, and I can tell you that one of the greatest deficiencies in NATO was to construct whole theories about how nuclear deterrence would work, never once looking at a completely different silo of people, of scholars, who were researching how the Soviets would have used nuclear weapons. And in fact, if you put the two together, the way NATO intended to use nuclear weapons would have resulted in a very nasty, much more massive counterstrike on the part of the Warsaw Pact, as we can tell from the documents of Warsaw Pact exercises. They were fully into launch on warning and with a much larger response. So basically what I'm saying is we should be much more interested in what another side is doing and how one should best preempt that or react to that, rather than in constructing theories in our own silo without looking at our adversaries. And the thing is, we should be looking at other countries, which this should involve deep immersion, learning their languages, understanding the cultural baggage of each concept, of each culture. And let me just point out just a little figure there. In 2018-2019, there were 120,000 Chinese students enrolled in UK universities alone. This is the great interest that particularly China shows in other cultures in what's going on. We have absolutely nothing reciprocal. So I'm not saying in any of this that the Chinese view of the world or the current Russian view of the world, definitely not the current Russian of the world, is better, particularly not in any ethical sense when I'm talking about Putin. But what I'm saying, it is that we really must understand how they think, how they tick, what ideals they have, what values they have and thoughts they have, in order better to prepare for a competition or worse with them. So let me sum up. We should be aware and we should rethink all our thinking about war by starting with the realization that the state is not always the actor, that we may want peace and ideally as quickly as possible, whereas others benefit from prolonged conflict, that we want to end wars quickly, others do not, that we think of a victory as final, a chess game that one has won, you get a prize, everything's fine. The other side, many other sides do not. They think of this as a temporary setback. They will regroup, they will re-prepare a new assault. We in our thinking, probably not you, but I think the public as a whole, is unduly fixated on battles when so much of warfare involves sieges, involves a gradual depletion of the other side's strengths, blockades, and simply the attrition that goes away with longer-term war. And we have this problem that international law, international humanitarian law and other sorts of it, need these binaries, but they do not really help us when we're trying to analyze war in a military sense to understand its real nature, which to me seems to be that war and peace are a continuum, with war and peace on the extreme sides, but lots of things happening in between. That defeat is reversible, that even a defeat can be presented as a victory, at least a moral victory, and that the distinction between soldiers and criminals and combatants and civilians are fluid, that there is much more fluidity than is allowed for by international law. And how we can adapt to this is really the great challenge. And I'll just thank you for your attention and hope for questions.
Muchas gracias, doctora. Bueno, como ustedes han podido apreciar, en la presentación la doctora nos ha demostrado que verdaderamente necesitamos los conceptos de la guerra, que la guerra no es binaria, que en los actuales escenarios tenemos una mezcla de condiciones y que es necesario entender los conflictos. Habló muy bien de la linealidad de la historia y hay que entender que muchos eventos, nosotros hemos estado acostumbrados a entender la historia como una línea, pero hay muchos eventos que ocurren en el pasado y después de muchos años vuelven a aparecer o han impactado a alguien. Y es por eso que es necesario analizar y entender el inicio de los conflictos, la cultura de las personas que están envueltas, entender los actores para poder tener un buen entendimiento. So we were talking about the complexity of war. Vamos a continuar con la segunda presentación del primer panel para posteriormente entrar a la fase de preguntas.
Procedemos entonces a la exposición del Teniente General Luigi Chiaperini con el tema Desde las operaciones de estabilización a la conducción de la guerra, una perspectiva terrestre, a quien recibimos con un fuerte aplauso.
Agradezco a contraalmirante Luis del Carpio por su invitación a este importante simposio. Saludo las autoridades y todos los participantes. Es un privilegio para mí estar aquí. En esto conclude mi presentación. I mean, this is my presentation in Espanol, in Spanish. That is a wonderful language that I unfortunately cannot speak. So in the next minutes, I will briefly speak about the evolution of military operation in the last years and how we essentially in Europe were short-sighted. I will then give a glance to the conflict, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, with some lessons identified. First of all, nations' military preparedness is a subject that should be addressed in peacetime rather than during a crisis when the remediation is too late. The ancient Romans used to say, "Si vis pacem, para bellum." That means, if you want really peace, then you should be prepared, you should be trained for war. This statement may seem commonplace and self-evident, but in Europe, as I said, in recent years, it has not been the case. The increasing danger and variability of current and future threats, as exemplified in Ukraine, but not limited to it, compel the armed forces to adapt their capabilities to operate across the full of operations. These operational domains have evolved and overlapped throughout history, and in this context, in more recent years, the information network, cyberspace, has gained significant importance, and space will soon follow suit. So today, those domains interlace and are considered coexistent to the extent that the concept of multi-domain joint and combined operations is widely discussed. One of the most commonly used opening phrases in recent decades that has been "with the fall of Berlin Wall," often followed by the subsequent assertion that traditional conflicts were expected to diminish in importance with growing emphasis on other domains such as cyberspace or the space. What has become of the ancient traditional warfare? With the fall of Berlin Wall, it was expected to be removed from the agenda, except for the deployment of relatively light forces to engage in essentially asymmetric conflicts aimed at stabilizing the new globalized world, as the professor said before. Hence, we witnessed the proliferation of peace support of operations with peacekeeping soldiers, peacekeepers, in many operational theaters such as Kosovo, Lebanon, Afghanistan. The European, but not only European armed forces have been engaged in typical stabilization, counterinsurgency, or counter-piracy operations. Especially the Western world public opinion, but also we as military, came to believe that these types of operations, missions, known as military operation other than war, will be the only mission in the future. Therefore, there will be no more traditional symmetric conflicts, or at most hybrid conflicts. Is this the case? To tell the truth, it may have appeared that way until February 2022. The conflict in Ukraine has radically changed this perspective. We are learning many lessons from that war. First and foremost, engaging in a full-fledged war is still a possibility. In reality, we can find the early symptoms farther back the Ukrainian war. Let's look at main armed conflicts with the presence, for instance, of heavy armored units that have occurred in the world since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Gulf War I, the Gulf War II, the Kosovo War, the Nagorno-Karabakh War, also in these days, have you seen? The Israel-Lebanon War, the Libyan Civil War, the Syrian Civil War, the conflict in Donbass. I'm talking about the conflict in 2014. This list is not exhaustive, and other significant conflicts with minimal but not necessarily precluding future predominance heavy ground components are not included, such as Yemen, the Sahel, Somalia, and I would add in a prospective sense, Taiwan. So let's broaden the discussion on what could be the areas of crisis in the world. To do that, let's start from the old but still valid Alfred Mackinder's Heartland theory and John Spixman's Rimland theory. The heartland is placed mainly in the center of Asia, while Rimland is the maritime and coastal strip surrounding Eurasia, Europe and Asia. It can be essentially divided into three zones, Rimland, the area of the European coast, to which I would add the North Africa and the Sahel, the Middle East area, and the South Asia zone. However, these theories can be applied everywhere as the global situation could change. In this context, and taking into account also the new threats, such as those emerging in Africa or in Chinese seas, we can identify three main arcs of global instability. The so-called Wide Mediterranean, from the Gulf of Guinea through Sahel up to the Middle East. Then the arc that includes the Persian Gulf, which can be extended to the Pakistani-India border, and the arc of the Indo-Pacific that from India includes the countries bordering the South and East Chinese seas and up to Bering Strait. And this is very interesting for you of American continent. In very simply word, having control of Rimland or Heartland, or even better, of both, means putting oneself in a position of great strategic advantage. Perhaps for this reason, few analysts predicted the outbreak of a classical war in Ukraine, right in the heart of Eastern Europe. In reality, every action of diplomatic, economic, political, military nature is functional to conquer or to consolidate one's position of advantage in the world chessboard. So why did Russia probably initiate this conflict? From Russian statements, we can discern several justifications, including the defense of Russian-speaking population in the self-proclaimed Donbas republics, the denazification and the demilitarization of Ukraine. However, the true motivations likely lie in regaining its role in the heartland, together with China, by toppling the pro-Western government of Ukraine, preventing Ukraine's entry into NATO and possibly in the European Union, regaining international prestige through a swift military campaign, acquiring territories to connect Russia to Crimea, thus creating a corridor down here in the south of Ukraine. For these reasons, NATO now considers the Russian Federation again a threat and China a challenge. Have we got ready? As I said, in Europe, we are only partially prepared. This is due a budget dedicated to defense for years of just over 1% of GDP, compared to 2% indicated by NATO as the minimum threshold to maintain a sufficient level of efficiency and effectiveness of the armed forces. That said, let me now go a little technical, because I believe it is important to know not only the issues and problems of own armed forces, but also those, acknowledge those of the other armed forces, as we, as said, must operate in a multi-domain environment. So, let's give a glance to the operations in Ukraine. It can be divided into 4 phases. Phase 1 began after a period during which Russian armed forces conducted extensive exercises near the Ukrainian border. During this phase, units from around 10 Russian combined armies entered Ukrainian territory from 5 different attack directions, covering approximately 1,500 kilometers of front. In the first phase, the main effort was in the north, directed towards the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, to neutralize what Russians saw as the center of gravity. That was the pro-Western government. The desired end state was probably, I will say surely, a regime change with all the positive outcomes for the Russian Federation. After the initial actions, the subsequent phases aimed at conquering the strategic port of Mariupol in the south, on the Sea of Azov, down here, which was eventually achieved in the second phase. There was also the potential for an amphibious operation on the city of Odessa, with possible further advance through Transnistria. So in the south here, Odessa, and here in Moldova, there is the Transnistria, that is a region where Russian population or pro-Russians live. However, this was not carried out, I mean the amphibious operation in Odessa, and now seems really less likely. And we will see why it is no more possible, but I know that you know already. Nevertheless, after initial successes by late March 2022, the Russian offensive stalled, unable to advance beyond the territories captured in the early days. At this point, it's worth noting that the initial phase of the attack had partially failed, as it involved nearly half, as I said, of Ukraine's entire land border, as said, about 1,500 kilometers, with forces suitable to attack at the most half of it. Why this choice? Was it due to incompetence among Russian military planners? Personally, I don't believe so. Instead, it was likely a political decision based on the belief that they could topple the government and collapse the Ukrainian army in a matter of days by simply attacking, as they did, and besieging the capital, Kiev. This might be seen as a gamble that did not pay off. Hence, the Russians referred to it as a special military operations instead, rather than an outright war, which in fact was never formally declared. By March 25th, 2022, to the surprise of many, Russian troops began withdrawing from the capital and other northern regions of Ukraine, focusing efforts on Donbass in the south, here, and the rest of the southern part of the country, initiating phase 2. Positive results began to emerge, although defending their center of gravity, that was the cohesion of the forces. In fact, it was challenging this due to the partial failure of the first phase, because the units in February suffered a lot and had low morale. However, it cannot be said that the Russians didn't achieve results in this phase. The important port city of Mariupol was captured, albeit at significant cost, along with several areas in Donbass. The minimum objective was nearly achieved. The conquest of most of southern Ukraine, as I said, to establish a land corridor and to make, Crimea no more isolated. Nonetheless, the July 4th, 2022, President Putin stated that the troops that had operated very well until then needed to rest and recover their operational capability, implicitly acknowledging that they had reached a new culminating point. What occurred in the third phase is well known. Ukrainians launched the first counteroffensive, reconquering some territories seized by the Russians in the first two phases. Initially, in September, Ukrainians regained the Kharkiv region and then began pushing towards the two self-proclaimed Donbas republics and the city of Kherson, which was later liberated. The Ukrainians could have achieved even greater success during this phase if they had access to modern tanks and aircraft for a more effective combined armed battle. This phase created a critical situation for the Russians, who responded with the mobilization of 300,000 soldiers, reservists, and conscripts. The unilateral annexation of territories through referendums, not internationally recognized, nuclear threats, and deep operations. These deep operations involved actions across the entire enemy territory using cruise missiles, including those launched from ships and submarines in the Black Sea, and drones aimed at degrading Ukraine's strategic infrastructures at the onset of the winter season. Throughout the winter, there was a substantial operational stalemate. the Russian private security company Wagner, led by Prigozhin, managed to capture the small town of Bakhmut at the cost of heavy losses, while Ukrainians prepared for the ongoing second counteroffensive. Let me underline that the reliance on private military companies, such as Wagner company, underscore the role of non-state actors, as underlined also by Professor. These private entities can be both an asset, a good asset in the hand of the people who employ them, but also a liability, as they may not always align with the objectives of who is going to employ them. And we saw Wagner companies, for instance, when they tried to reach Moscow, and we saw also Prigozhin what kind of final had. Currently, the Ukrainians are achieving partial successes by slowly disrupting Russian first defensive line in few sectors, particularly south of Zaporizhia. Sorry. Yeah. South here. However, Ukrainians still lack the two critical capabilities that I mentioned earlier: an adequate number of modern aircrafts and tanks. And I would add also the mining capabilities. Nevertheless, they have still the initiative and gained some terrain. This could allow them to reach some key positions from which be able to cut, at least by fire, the land corridor. I don't know, this is the right, okay. Okay, the land corridor I was speaking about to connect Russia with Crimea. In conclusion here, it seems that the final outcome in Ukraine will likely be determined on land in order to put on the future negotiating table by the Russians the conquered territories, or by the Ukrainians the regained areas. The upcoming weeks will determine the outcome, at least for this year. So currently we had, and we probably will have, as the professor said, some decisive battle, but not complete victories, at least in the short term. The Russian gamble of launching operation along excessively wide line with an unfavorable balance of forces, time, and space led to the unavailability of second echelon forces and proper reserves. I put here some ancient Romans. You say, what, ancient Romans? Some principles of war are valid every time. I mean, the professor mentioned Sun Tzu, for instance. I mean, there are some basic principles that are there and that are not changing. The composition and organization of forces were flawed, and after initial successes failed to facilitate a continued maneuver in depth, allowing an effective response from Ukrainian forces. relying on force packages for limited wars or special military operations like this is perilous. I mean, operations are operations, meaning that there are no distinctions between A-tier and B-tier operations. When initiating a military operation, military activities like those in Ukraine, it's crucial to do so with all the components necessary to face the entire spectrum of threats, even for not foreseeing extended duration. Probably the Russians, they thought that it would be last maximum some weeks, 1 month, 2 months. It was not the case. Moreover, it seems that one of the fundamental rules of warfare, namely unity of command, with a streamlined chain of command and control, was not adhered to. Until well into the military campaign, it appears that the Russians made a questionable choice by entrusting operations to numerous commands, thereby failing to ensure unity of intent and concentration of efforts, attacking, as we saw, along nearly independent directions. Consequently, there was likely an excessive initial dispersion of military resources, distributed rather haphazardly among almost all the commanders of the Russian Federation military districts. In addition, some of those commanders did not always seem up to the task, with some being relieved of their duties. All this led to the March 2022 operational stalemate just a few days into the conflict. Another critical lesson concerns the role of heavy armored units in modern warfare. With the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the end of the East-West confrontation, it appeared that tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, field artillery had no future. However, in a hybrid conflict with strong symmetric characteristics, where defending territory from enemy ground attacks is still relevant, mobility, protection, engagement capabilities of infantry and field artillery remain crucial. Nevertheless, it was observed that some of these vehicles, if not adequately protected, were vulnerable to old and new threats posed by state-of-the-art anti-tank weapon system. I'm referring, for instance, Javelin, armored drones, such as loitering munitions. Let's watch a video clip here. Can click on the icon. Please. Por favor. So, in the video clip, I don't know if we will be able to watch it. You will see some tanks fighting, and one of them destroyed, another one damaged, and both the Russians and the Ukrainians had a lot of these armored units destroyed. No problem. We go on without watching. It's okay. It's going. Okay. So there is an urgent need to equip these vehicles with more than all-around active and passive protection. Okay, that's enough. Another lesson identified concerned the till now forgotten active and passive obstacles, specifically referring to items like minefield, trenches, dragon teeth, something that we thought were okay during the Cold War, so no more. We don't need these kind of obstacles, so we don't need anymore also demining vehicles, for instance. It was a big mistake because they are playing a fundamental role in slowing down, for instance, right now, the Ukrainian second counteroffensive. I'm talking about the minefield, a lot of minefield. Closely related to this, so as I said, is the importance of systems for breaching minefields, which had been largely neglected but are now deemed again indispensable. Unmanned systems, ground, naval, and aerial, that were already considered crucial for basic functions like reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, surveillance, target acquisition, are now being employed very effectively at all operational levels, including the tactical one, using also commercial and cost-effective adapted platform. We can accurately call them flying improvised explosive devices for kinetic actions like these. We have another video clip. A terrible one. You will see infantry going around in the field, and some commercial drones with some ordnance that hit them and kill them. You can see here. down in the bunker. So they will go and check what is going on. Then they are aware that another one is coming. They will take recover, but other drones arrive. It's okay, thank you. Thank you, okay. We are sure. Fine, thank you. Modern systems, for instance, electronic warfare, are required to neutralize these inexpensive yet devastating weapons, sometimes used in swarms. The value of electronic warfare and cyber capabilities cannot be overstated. EW played a significant role in disrupting not only drones, but also command and control systems and communication. Cyber attacks, though less visibly, are also playing a significant role. Deep operations involving long-range fire, artillery, ships, aircrafts, and specialized units behind the front lines are crucial to disrupt the adversary's rear support activities, which enable effective frontline combat. Also in this issue, the cooperation between infantry and artillery, especially with precision-guided munitions such as HIMARS, to strike deep targets, disrupt enemy movements, and inflict unsustainable losses remain vital. Finally, two brief considerations on air and naval components. The conflict reaffirmed the importance of combined arms operation, integrating air, land, sea, and cyber components to address a wide range of threats from conventional warfare to irregular and hybrid tactics. Protection and mobility of armored units, enhanced air defense capability, and effective counter-drone measures are essential for modern forces to adapt to evolving threats. In this context, Russian air support appeared in some phases not decisive, while more lethal appeared cruise missiles and suicide drones. Speaking about the Russian Navy, despite being the master of the Black and, soon after, the first phases of the conflict, the Azov Seas, the Russian Navy was not able to ensure not only a complete A2AD, meaning anti-access and area denial, especially in the south of Ukraine, but also all the necessary support that the land component would have expected from the sea. So Russian naval support played a less prominent role than expected, with the focus shifting towards deep operations surface-to-surface missiles launched by vessels and submarines, and, very important, the logistic support due to the poor land supply roads. So they brought, they supplied the forces in the front by ships. So, although the Kiev Navy practically does not exist, the coordinated and continued use of small amphibious units, air and naval suicide drones, and missiles has caused significant damage to the military instruments of both the contenders. This is quite a bit worrying for the Russians. I mean, they are the second armed forces in the world. But at the end of the day, the crucial bridge of Kerch, I mean the Crimea bridge, many important ships, I mean flagship Moskva, one frigate, one submarine, two landing ships, other minor vessels were destroyed. They had the complete control, or they were supposed to have the complete support of the Black Sea. For that reason, I said it's a bit worrying for the Russians. Also, here we got a short video clip in which you will see a Russian vessel hit by a naval drone. That's another very big issue for you. Also for us, because then we will not get any support from you. This is a suicide drone. Okay, thank you. Okay, now some consideration on amphibious units. They were employed primarily in ground roles due to limitations on naval assets of both the Ukrainians and the Russians. This is because the Ukrainian, as said, did not have a navy worthy of the name, with the Russians that lost some amphibious units, I mean landing ships, the flagship Moskva, as I said, and some other ships sank or destroyed in the ports. Therefore, for instance, during the battle for Mariupol and in many other sectors, amphibious units clashed, Marines clashed and are still fighting on the ground instead of being projected, for instance, from the sea to catch Odessa, for instance. On the other hand, the effectiveness of Marines and special units is demonstrated by the amphibious, specifically riverine operations that the Ukrainian are conducting along the Dnieper River and in the Black Sea. They are using tactics that are going to be adopted, for example, from the by the United States Marine Corps. To sum up, effective coordination between small amphibious units, drones, and air, navy, land-based missiles disrupted Russian military assets in key areas, including the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. Someone says also that the commander was killed. It's not sure so far. Let me conclude. Ultimately, the conflict in Ukraine is underlining the need of comprehensive military forces capable of responding to a wide range of threats, from conventional warfare to irregular and hybrid tactics. We must think not only to the new weaponry that appeared during the conflicts, but also to the future ones. For instance, laser weapons, artificial intelligence-assisted systems. In this concept, the ability to conduct combined arms operations with well-integrated land, sea, air, cyber components with up-to-date armaments remains crucial in modern and future conflict scenarios. The conflict in Ukraine highlights the importance of adapting and modernizing forces to meet evolving and sometimes unexpected threats. We should start thinking future geostrategic scenarios in the aforementioned arcs of instability. In this sense, and I won't be clear, we must be able to face strategic surprises. All people should remember that engaging in a full-fledged war is still a possibility, and that for that reason, vis pacem para bellum, and this statement is still dramatically valid. So thanks for your attention.
Bueno, agradecemos al general Chiaperini con su experiencia en combate, ya tanto en Kosovo como en Afganistán y en Líbano. Podemos ver que nos ha dado una presentación no solo de los conceptos, sino también de la situación actual que se vive en Europa. El año pasado pude escuchar la graduación de los cadetes de Alemania, y la ministra de Defensa de Alemania comenzó su discurso diciendo: Europa está en guerra, y esa es la realidad. Y es necesario entender el conflicto, y como bien lo dijo la doctora, en un conflicto armado actual se presentan varias facetas, varias definiciones, y actualmente creo que lo estamos viendo de una manera real en el conflicto en Ucrania y Rusia. Entonces vamos a comenzar con la fase de preguntas. Los alumnos que deseen participar con alguna pregunta, los asistentes también. Tenemos gente que está lista con los micrófonos para poder comenzar con esta fase de preguntas y respuestas.
deben ser los estados. La forma de combatir las amenazas irregulares es trabajando entre estados y la clave es la confianza entre ellos, como de lo que se está tratando este foro. Y para complementar quería dar un ejemplo. El ejemplo que quería poner es el fenómeno migratorio que está sufriendo Europa y bueno, todo el mundo en realidad, ¿no? Si el objeto de referencia de la seguridad es la persona, el enfoque de los estados será una política migratoria muy permisiva y con ello las organizaciones de narcotráfico terroristas podrían infiltrarse. Pero si el enfoque de seguridad es el Estado, la política de seguridad será más estricta, minimizando con ellos los riesgos a la seguridad de los estados. Gracias.
Thank you very much for this question. Human security, the very fact that you are focusing your question on human security incidentally distinguishes us from many other states. And it shows what a very Western approach you have, because you start with the idea, by focusing on human security, you start with the idea that that is the most important thing. Just before that, however, you talked about the strength of the state. Yeah. So I think a lot of our adversaries are more interested in the strength of their own state than in human security. Now, the two combined, you said, is it not a strong state that will help us enforce human security? Is it not a strong state that will help us combat international crime? Yes, certainly, it is a strong state in which there is no corruption, or very little corruption, in which all the organs work together, but on the basis of international law and of human rights. And that, I mean, I fully go along with you in saying that it's good to have a strong, healthy state. Healthy is possibly even the better word, than one that is in itself very corrupt and very weak and very dysfunctional. But to talk about human security, to address the second part of your question, I would say that we have a challenge in that the human beings that we defend, the human security we defend, may in many parts of the world be something that is at the same time the source of insecurity. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In Kosovo, in the Yugoslav wars, but also in some other wars, we needed to create human security for people who were refugees, etc. But it is quite possible that a conflict is perpetuated by people who are initially the weak refugees from persecution and later harbor the intention to get their revenge on those who have persecuted them, possibly a generation later, possibly sooner than that. One of the great challenges to us is not just the healthiness of our own state, but our ability or inability to mediate in conflicts so as to bring about what I was talking about in my lecture, namely the end of a conflict, rather than to let it drag on so that new generations will renew the conflict after that. So in a way, human security is also about working very hard to reconcile warring parties and to bring about a new approach to their living together. Thank you.
Acá tenemos una pregunta del comandante Negreiros para el general. Usted habló sobre el control del corazón de Europa por Rusia, y actualmente se está viendo que en la guerra se está usando tecnología comercial, como usted lo presentó. ¿Usted piensa que el uso de estos medios tecnológicos van a cambiar la manera en que se lleva la guerra tradicionalmente, y cómo se puede usar los conceptos de guerra estudiados para combates futuros?
porque they are already changing the way to conduct the war. I mean, when the Russian tanks entered Ukraine, they were not prepared to face the new threat of the commercial drones, because they, not only those, I mean, Javelin anti-tank missile was lethal. But then they had to face also new threats, such as drones, and they were prepared. The Ukrainians were not prepared as well. Then can be introduced in a conflict, and however, I don't think that they will change the way to conduct a war. We must adapt to those new threats, and in fact, they are adapting already by using, for instance, electronic to neutralize drones, suicide drones. They are going, I'm sure, to use laser weapons to shoot them down. But at the end of the day, we still need ships, we still need aircrafts, we still need boots on the ground, because at the end of the day, again, if you want to get some results, then you have to have your units in some position. And you have seen the Russian, for them, probably it would be a victory, even though they were partially defeated, by occupying the corridor in the south of Ukraine. And then they will say, I have Novorossiya, I think that they call that area. I have the Crimea now is safe because I have a buffer zone in the north of Crimea. I have a corridor that with the link with with Russia, I mean the Russian territory. I have also 4 new regions that now belong to Russia. So it's okay. That's it. But again, the new technologies will born and will be used and will be using in the next future in the conflicts. But I don't think that they will dramatically change the way to conduct the war. We must adapt to them.
Ahí tenemos otra pregunta. Sí, alcáncela.
Good morning. My question is, Lieutenant Commander Linares, my question is to the Professor Heuser. You mentioned that in the continuum of war, we are going towards the war edge of the continuum. So what do you think can we expect in the future? Can we expect a fragmentation of war where, for example, breaks go bigger and stronger, and then the non-alienated states choose a side or create a new one? Or can we expect a path where the world is a way back into a bipolar order? Thank you.
If I've understood it correctly, you were asking about whether we would tolerate the creation of new states, is that
No
right?
states, organization like a multipolar organization of the world, a balance of powers, let's say.
Whether we would accept a multipolar world, is that right? No.
If we can
It's,
expect...
can you hold the microphone like that?
It's okay. You mentioned that in the continuum of war, we are going towards the worst side of the continuum, where war is might possible. And now we are in the outside of the Cold War, where we had a bipolar order. Can we expect a multipolar order where the world is fragmented into many points, or can we expect a path into a bipolar world? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry about my slowness to comprehend. We still have a legal system which we created that was created in 1945. The legal system is still that one based on the UN, but as you know, the UN Security Council is paralyzed by the differences of opinion between the multipolar great powers that are in there and have the veto power. But for the moment, we still have the legal situation where, according to the Charter, it is illegitimate to attack another country in order to change borders. And I would say that the Ukraine war is currently playing out whether that order will survive only in letter or also in application. Because if the international order, according to the law, is not upheld by the other states of the world, and if states of the world find it convenient to back Russia in this war or to side with Russia in the BRICS, for example, then we only have the letter of the law and not its enforcement surviving. That means that the international order that is very much in our interest, because we don't want aggression, will be hollow, will be ever more brittle, will be ever more the one that is only there in word but not in deed, and we will be sliding back into a 19th century situation where might is right. I don't think we know yet what the outcome will be, but I think that the Ukraine war is at the center of whether we go this way or that way, whether we slide back into the past or whether we preserve the acquis of the United Nations and its charter. Thank you.
Gracias. Le vamos a hacer una pregunta al general porque creo que en este conflicto han aparecido grupos los cuales están participando en acciones ofensivas, pero son mercenarios y están siendo pagados para hacer ese trabajo. Entonces quería consultarle al general cuáles son las implicancias del uso de estos grupos armados.
We have discussed with some of you also about this last Wednesday, I believe. As I said on that occasion, private companies were born in the United States, and I had the opportunity to work together with them in many missions. For instance, in Afghanistan, they had the task to protect some compounds of governmental, non-governmental organizations to provide escort for local authorities, for instance, and so on. They were few hundred people, I mean, few hundred. But then we had some countries that exploited this kind of help. Because why help? Because for the tasks that I mentioned, it is not worthy to use regular troops. Regular troops are going to fight to control the territory, and they have other operational tasks. So if you have some people that can do some secondary tasks, it's okay. But when you have private security companies composed by 10, 30,000 mercenaries that come from prisons, jail, for instance, and then you use them by putting at their command a man that is not a military, is not an officer, and you provide them with tanks, aircrafts, helicopters, a lot of money, weapons, a lot of weapons, and you give them also some autonomy in operating in the field. It would be really dangerous. And you have seen, for instance, as I said, Wagner private company, what they did last May, I believe, in Russia. So, as I said, it's okay for some activities. They are largely used by Russians in a lot of countries in Africa, in Libya, and Central Africa, but not only Russians. So they are okay for some tasks, but they are really a danger for who is going to use them, because then they can be an internal problem in your country, but also outside the boundaries, your borders. Okay?
Gracias. Tenemos una pregunta. Estamos transmitiendo el evento en vivo, online, y tenemos una pregunta para la doctora Heuser. En los últimos años, la OTAN develó algunos puntos débiles a partir del gran soporte que reciben los Estados Unidos y que Donald Trump criticó, y quien justamente lidera las encuestas para las próximas elecciones. ¿Considera usted que la Unión Europea podría fortalecer ese rol defensivo que su estatuto avala para reducir la dependencia de Estados Unidos, con el riesgo que implicaría que pierda esa connotación meramente comercial que se tiene de la Unión Europea?
Thank you very much. I emphasize that I am not in any way speaking on behalf of the German government, the Führungsakademie, or anything like that. So, there is the European integration process has, since the 1950s, really hesitated to take a step in the direction of autonomy. And ever since the 1950s, when in fact there was a first reduction of US armed forces based in Europe, the Radford Plan in the second half of the 1950s, Europeans have every now and then said, gosh, we need more autonomy. We need to be able to defend ourselves, even if a situation should arise where America is focused on another theater of war. The Biden administration's national security strategy has made it quite clear for the first time that America does not expect to be able fully to be the central actor if there were two big conflicts, both in the Pacific area and in Europe at the same time, but it would rely heavily on its European allies to take care of the European side. The European Union has, ever since the 1950s also, every now and then made little steps in the direction of being more of a coherent actor, of a performant actor in security matters. In the 1990s, there was a big initiative to try to make the European Union, as it then began to be called for the first time, the European pillar of NATO that should be able to act even if it was only more indirectly supported by the United States. And yet the European countries, the member states of the European Union, have always hesitated to take the appropriate steps actually to increase the burden of their own defense. I think, again, as many times before, we are facing big decisions here, and by attempting to increase their own defense expenditure to the 2% that have been promised to NATO, there is perhaps a real chance on the horizon now that something in that direction may be taken. I think the Dutch defense attaché is here. I saw the Dutch flag, but importantly, the Netherlands have actually already moved in that direction and have assumed that the European Union must be able to act and have taken steps towards impressive integration with allied countries in order to make this possible. I think there is a possibility now, but there were possibilities like that many times in the past which the Europeans didn't take advantage of. So I hesitate to predict whether this is now finally going to work. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Doctora Heuser, thank you very much for the presentation. General Chiapperini, it was an honor to have you here in the first panel. Agradecemos a toda la audiencia, no solo a los que están presentes, sino también a los que nos están siguiendo en línea desde varios países también, y a los oficiales de la Marina de Guerra del Perú que también nos están siguiendo desde sus unidades y dependencias a través del sistema que hemos abierto. Vamos a proceder a terminar este primer bloque con el break, agradeciendo la atención que han tenido con la primera parte de este simposio. Muchas gracias.
Bienvenidos nuevamente a la segunda parte de este foro internacional, el futuro de la seguridad y la defensa ante los escenarios y conflictos actuales, dentro del marco del 10º Simposio Internacional de Oficiales de la Nueva Generación de las Armadas de América. A continuación, dejo con ustedes al magíster Johannes Peters, director del Centro de Estrategia y Seguridad Marítima de la Universidad de Kiel, con el título Descuidada y subestimada: ¿por qué la seguridad marítima latinoamericana debería ser de interés fundamental para Europa?, a quien recibimos con un fuerte aplauso.
Good day, everybody. Before I start, I want to express my sincere thanks to the Peruvian Navy, not only for giving me the opportunity to speak to such a distinguished audience, but also for their extraordinary hospitality I was able to receive over the last couple of days. So thank you very much for that. Also thank you to Konrad Adenauer Foundation for making it possible for me to come over here to speak to you. Okay, admirals, attachés, distinguished guests. What I'm trying to do now in the next couple of minutes is to give you an impression how the European perspective on maritime security differ from actually the perspective in Latin and South America, and why some of the challenges you're facing here do have a direct implication in Europe as well, and why Europe should pay a greater attention to this maritime security challenges. The tactic I've chosen is obviously shock and awe, overwhelming you with PowerPoint warfare and hoping that you fall asleep after probably the next couple of slides. No, you can be relaxed. Three good things about this slide. The first thing is I'm going to explain it to you in a second. The second thing is you can ignore about 80% of it. And the last thing is it's the most complex slide I have, so it gets easier from here on, I promise. So what we see here is that's a product my department is actually doing. They're collecting open source intelligence and they provide a weekly update where the German Navy is actually operating in exercises and operations and whatsoever. And once a year we produce a report and listing all these data to you can read it up. So that was my my attempt to shamelessly sew in a little commercial block. I hope you forgive me. And I used it just as a background because it's a good overview with the geography. The slogan, regionally rooted, globally committed, we see here, is actually the slogan the German Navy uses to explain their area of responsibilities, their duties to the public. So that's why I choose the slogan the German Navy is using. I'm going to get along with the German Navy as an example for a European Navy because I'm German, obviously, and it is nearest to me, but it's quite comparable actually to most European navies. So that it will do the trick for today. I also took these ellipses from the German Navy because that's actually the ellipses they use to identify the different areas of responsibility and the different tasks they're actually fulfilling there. And as you can see, we have I will come back to that later, to use globally committed. They're using this ellipse here, and this excludes actually this area here. Which is not by coincidence, I fear, and I think that's a mistake. We are focusing too much on the Indo-Pacific currently when we are talking about global commitment in Europe. Okay, let's start with the first and core ellipse. That's the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is back actually on the strategic landscape, if you don't want to call it that way. The Baltic Sea was a core area of responsibility during the Cold War. Then after 1990 and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, it became, or it lost attention a bit. We lost attention of it a bit. It was mainly an area for trade. It was an area for leisure cruise, of course, pretty nice. And now the Baltic Sea is actually back on the strategic agenda. Not only since Russia's all-out war against Ukraine last year, but basically since 2014, you can say, since the illegal annexation of Crimea. What is true is that the strategic conditions in the Baltic have changed dramatically, and dramatically into the favor of NATO, of course, because with Finland now being a member of NATO and Sweden will become a member of NATO hopefully soon, all the Baltic Sea actually, excluding the Oblast of Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg here, is actually surrounded by NATO country, or when we talk about Sweden, a very, very close ally right now, not a NATO member yet. That alters, of course, the strategic calculus. But in some publications, you read things like the Baltic Sea has become a NATO lake, or it's a NATO, it's kind of a Mare Nostrum for the NATO, and that's definitely not the case. It's not the case in a tactical way, because the Russian capabilities are still there. They haven't gone away. So, and they still have to be fought down if you want to operate in the Baltic Sea. What has changed is that NATO now has a vast hinterland, which it hasn't had before, that is gives us new strategic objectives in regard of using Air Force units, for example. But it also has increased the need to keep these sea lines of communication open in case of conflict, because not only NATO would have to reinforce the Baltic states in a case of conflict, it would also have to reinforce Finland in a case of conflict, because Finland isn't to be reinforced by land due to the climate condition and stuff like that. So the necessity to keep these sea lines open and to be able actually to operate under a threat environment there has even become bigger, not smaller. The second thing is a legal aspect, if you want to call it that way. NATO promotes international rules-based order, and this is pretty much comes down to the right of free and innocent passage. And of course, that means that the Baltic Sea will remain open for these principles of a free and open innocent passage to everybody who adheres to the rules, and that includes, of course, Russia if it sticks to to international law. So that's the two aspects why the Baltic Sea isn't a NATO lake or a NATO sea. But it's an area where actually one aspect of for the German Navy, but also for European navies and European armed forces in a whole, is back on the agenda, and that is credible deterrence, credible, robust deterrence, and the ability to actually fight high-intensity conflict. That is something which, as has been cited in the presentations in the previous panel, something which has kind of atrophied in European armed forces, and we have to relearn it now. And the Baltic Sea has always been and still is the core area of responsibility for the German Navy, because the German Navy is pretty much tailor-made with lots of its assets for operating in this shallow environment, with our tailor-made submarines, not only the submarines but also the expertise that comes with it, the corvettes, and something that's often overlooked, or SIGINT capabilities, and also in the command and control area, where Germany is seeing its core responsibilities in the Baltic Sea. So for being broader and saying, okay, what kind of maritime security threat we are facing here, and what do we have to deal with? This is actually an area where we have to establish a robust deterrence posture, and where we have to regain the capabilities to victoriously fight a high-end naval warfare, not only naval warfare but a high-end conflict. The Mediterranean Sea, the Mediterranean actually, from a maritime security perspective, is very, very interesting, because everything you need to put pressure on an area, to generate conflicts, comes together perfectly in the Mediterranean Sea at our southern flank in Europe, but also from a NATO perspective. So what do we have here? We have mass migration, obviously, we have talked about it, and we're facing a massive increase in mass migration via the sea currently. We have disputed exclusive economic zones between partners, namely Greece and Turkey, which are more partners on paper, not like in real life. We have conflicts over resources that comes along with disputed EEZs, which come along with the still unsolved Cyprus conflict. We have conflicts over the access to gas fields, for example. Water becoming an ever increasing factor here when we look at the desertification of the Levantine coast. We have the religious and ethnological conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Palestine-Israeli conflict, the Hezbollah as a destabilizing factor supported by Iran. You're all probably familiar with that. We have failing states actually bordering the Mediterranean Sea, namely Libya, and to be honest, Lebanon is on its way to become a failing state as well. And we have something which quite new, a Russian naval base in Tartus in Syria. Russia always, or the Soviet Union, always wanted to have a permanent naval base in the Mediterranean during the Cold War. They never achieved that, but they now have one in Tartus in Syria, and that unbinds them from the restriction of the Montreux Convention. Makes it much easier for them to station their assets in the Mediterranean Sea. And not being, it's not necessary anymore to like pass the Bosporus and the Dardanelles for resupply and maintenance and stuff like that. So that is, it's not a threat per se, but it's another like vector added to the strategic environment there. That's the Mediterranean. So in the Mediterranean, when we look at the maritime security task there, we're not so much talking about robust deterrence, but we're talking about the need to have a proper maritime picture. So maritime situational awareness, and the better we are in creating this maritime situational awareness, the better we are in deterring any aggressor against critical maritime infrastructure, against supporting mass migration and any kind of malign activities that may occur there. So that is the strategic challenge actually we're facing in the Mediterranean. North Atlantic is like, I mean, that's Hunt for Red October, right? That's the classic stuff. That has never really gone away, but it's now back on the agenda. At the end of the day, when we're talking about a large-scale conflict in Europe, we still would have to rely on the resupplies from North America to Europe. So it still means like keeping the sea lines of communication open, and we're back to scenarios like having a proper ASW capability in the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, being able to provide escort operations in the open Atlantic, and also to be able to grant access to not only to the North Sea harbors here, but also to the Baltic Sea, which means with capabilities in mining operations, demining operations, all this classical, let's say, classical naval craftsmanship. So that's one part of the agenda there. And now I'm going further to the Indo-Pacific, which, remember, going back to my first slide, represents actually the globally committed part of the slogan, which in fact pretty much comes down to some kind of maritime presence or military presence, but mostly maritime, in the wider Indo-Pacific region. And the Indo-Pacific region stretches from the Horn of Africa, of course, all the way to the South China Sea and beyond it. So what's the reason for that? The reason for that is from the one side, we have to underpin national and EU strategies, mainly the EU maritime strategy, but also the Indo-Pacific guidelines Germany issued 2 years ago, and the recently published national security strategy, the ever first Germany issued. And there's a lot of promoting an international rules-based order, strengthening regional multilateralism to counter the hegemonial ambitions of China. That is classic naval diplomacy tasks. Another very important aspect that is sometimes overlooked a bit, and that comes back a little bit to the question one of the colleagues had to Beatrice Heuser in the previous panel. It is also critical for Europe to show support to the so-called U.S. pivot to Asia. So the strategic shift of the USA, explicitly the U.S. Navy, away from the European theater more to the Asian theater, and it's quite crucial actually for European states to show support of this U.S. strategic shift. Why? to make it easier for US officials to justify support for Europe domestically. Yeah? Because, as it had been said, the Biden administration is much more polite than the Trump administration when it comes to talking to the partners, but the baseline is not so far away. It's basically do more for your own security and safety. Yeah? We will probably have your back, but not as fast as you might think, and not as strongly as you might think. So, and to being able to hold up this position domestically, it helps a lot when European armed forces show support for the US ambitions in Southeast Asia. So going there is not only a nice thing and gaining experience in operating far abroad, but it's also critical in regard of alliance coherence, if you want to call it that way. To sum that up, European navies and Europe facing the whole spectrum of maritime security challenges, from low intensity to crisis management, from maritime situational awareness, up to being able to deter a peer competitor and to hopefully be able to fight a high-end conflict or high-end war if we have to. That is different to the maritime security challenges Latin America is facing. And the one thing is geography, right? It's obvious that you're lacking a coast on the other side, so you just have open sea around you, which makes it easier in some cases. And the security challenges faced in this region are completely different, actually. Interstate conflict is unlikely, so there's no need for a robust deterrence posture, actually. Most of the security challenges Latin American states facing would be subsumized probably under low intensity operations. So it's protecting and monitoring the EEZ, countering illegal activities like drug trafficking, smuggling, fight against IUU fishing, which is not a small task, but it's a different security task than European navies are facing, and that leads to a different maritime posture and also to different fleet structures, which actually is, in my opinion, it is an advantage because it's much easier to have to create a fleet that suits your needs. Like European Navy, the US Navy as well, we're always struggling to have what we call a balanced fleet. A fleet that is capable of low intensity operations, international crisis management, all these kind of things, which is pretty much the daily doing of most navies, but at the same time being capable of for the high intensity conflict at sea. To reach this balanced fleet is almost impossible. It's a constant struggle, but it has never been achieved in a really sufficient manner, actually. That's much easier with the maritime security challenges actually Latin America is facing, because it's easier to build a fleet around the needs you have. And I think what we currently see, the trend towards offshore patrol vessels in Latin America is exactly shows exactly this development, because offshore patrol vessels are perfectly suited for most of the maritime security challenges you're facing. They're relatively cheap, which is always a good argument, and they can do most of the task you're actually facing. You can challenge me on that probably. So now I will go to pick out, if you want to call it that way, two of the challenges you're facing and bring them together with European security. So the one is IUU fishing. IUU fishing is one of the major challenges not only Latin America is facing. It's a global problem. It's a huge problem in West Africa and East Africa as well, but it's a huge problem here as well. So the depletion of maritime or marine livestock affects European food security as well, because we all live from the same oceans. And the consequences facilitate actually European security challenges. Destabilization because of food shortages leads to more migration, especially when we come to Africa, which is a problem for Europe, as I have shown you a couple of minutes ago. And if you want to put it more like in a more pathetic way, of course, it is part of our responsibility for the global commons, because most of the livestock are not within the EEZs, but on the open seas, which is a global common. So, supporting Latin America in countering IUU fishing supports regional stability, and that's true for Latin America, but it's even more true, I think, for Africa. And it's one aspect of our strategic aim to countering China's growing international influence. Because what we see it in, Beatrice Heuser has talked about it on Wednesday, we see it all around the world, even in Europe, that China seeks to gain like economic influence, and from that economic influence, using this economic influence to seek political influence on states. We've seen that in Europe as well, but there's also the risk that China is using its growing economic influence. It tries to gain via fishing, because not only it's not only IUU fishing, but also, as you know better than I, China has gained a foothold in the fish processing industries in some Latin American countries, which poses quite a risk for the local economies as well. And that is when our own security interest to limit the political influence when it comes to things like renegotiating the Antarctic Treaty, which is about to start probably in the next decade or so. And we do have an interest in keeping the Antarctica actually economically free, which is not within the interest of other players, namely China. So that's an aspect where the maritime security challenges you are facing and the interests you are having directly tailor into our strategic interests. Another aspect is, of course, drug trafficking. A significant percentage of the drugs produced here shipped to Europe are shipped via West Africa, and that is a problem for Europe for more than one reason. Why? Obviously, there's a lot of drugs coming into Europe, which is a problem we have, but it leads to more destabilization in West Africa and the African countries, which leads to more migration movements towards the European Union. And it's another problem. The drug trafficking via West Africa is mostly controlled by the Hezbollah, from the organization that sits in the Lebanon. Is a destabilizing factor there, and the Hezbollah has not only become one of the main facilitators of drug trafficking via the African states to Europe, it had also become one of the major organizations for money laundering for the European organized crime. So a lot of the money that is made by European organized crime goes to the Hezbollah, and they wash it, and it comes back to Europe as like declared like white money, if you want to call it that way, and it supports also the drug economy in West Africa. So, countering drug trafficking via West Africa is something, or supporting Latin America in countering drug trafficking is something which fills not only in the maritime security interest of Europe, but in our security interest as a whole. So there are two examples why and how, or two fields, why and how Europe should pay more attention actually to maritime security issues and threats that originates here or that are an issue for Latin American countries, which are connected to our strategic interests and to our security as well. So to sum this up, as I've just said, maritime security challenges in Latin America are affecting Europe as well. So we should pay more attention to them. And more maritime commitment would actually suit our strategic interests. As I've shown, countering China's global influence, fighting international organized crime, and stabilizing regions in our nearer abroad, actually, namely Africa. And why do I think that maritime security challenges may be a good, not the starting point, but a good point for more cooperation? It's because actually Europe and Latin America do have strong connections when it comes to maritime security. We have strong connections when it comes to shipbuilding, when it comes to the education of officers. So all these connections are there, and they are too often overlooked. They are not considered like a strategic asset from the European perspective, and I think that should be taken into more consideration into Europe, that we do have actually reliable and grown relationships with Latin America that we can exploit. So, thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Muchas gracias, Johannes. Creo que la presentación de Johannes Peters ha demostrado de que en varias áreas marítimas, oceánicas, tenemos varios retos, y existen en algunas, como a veces uno no ve, en el Mediterráneo también grandes retos que las marinas de esa área tienen que enfrentar, ¿no? Y el impacto que hay en cosas en este mundo globalizado que ocurren en un lado y que tienen impacto directo en el otro lado del mundo. Vamos a continuar con la siguiente ponencia.
Pasamos a nuestro cuarto y último ponente de la mañana, vicealmirante Edmundo Luis Enrique de Vil del Campo, expresidente del Consejo de la Organización Marítima Internacional de las Naciones Unidas, con el título La OMI y los retos de la seguridad marítima, a quien de igual manera recibimos con un fuerte aplauso.
Muy agradecidos, señores. Es un placer estar con ustedes. Obviamente yo voy a dictar mi conferencia en español. Espero que sea de todo su agrado. Primeramente quería obviamente mencionar esto. Las palabras son solamente mías y nada más que mías. Me echan la culpa a mí, no voy a decir que sea otra persona. Lo principal desde el punto de vista de nosotros es que, y esta frase la expresó el almirante del general de Gaulle, y es que los estados no tienen amigos, solamente tienen intereses, y siempre van a estar ustedes enfocados en lo que son los intereses nacionales. Si no, le va a pasar lo que le pasó a Venezuela en 1899, cuando dejó un laudo, le dejó su trabajo que debía hacer, se lo pasó a Estados Unidos, y Estados Unidos tenía que defenderlo contra Inglaterra. Resultado, perdió 157.000 kilómetros cuadrados, ganó 5.000, y todos los ganaron el Imperio Británico. O sea que, por favor, siempre tienen que estar ustedes atentos a los intereses de las naciones, de sus naciones, y estar pendiente de ello. ¿Qué vamos a ver ahora? Básicamente es una pequeña introducción y luego los antecedentes de la creación de la OMI y de los aspectos de seguridad que están relacionados con la OMI y que tienen que ver con ella. Básicamente como comercio marítimo, como fuente de recursos, el terrorismo, la ciberseguridad, las alteraciones del entorno marítimo y un último aspecto que fue el acuerdo del Mar Negro para los cereales cuando tuvo que exportarlos Ucrania. Y finalmente algunas conclusiones. Bien, básicamente, y esto es más importante, el mar no nos separa, el mar nos une. El mar es una vía para comunicación e intercambio entre los pueblos. Por lo tanto, obviamente nos permiten desarrollar una serie de interacciones. Nosotros exportamos más o menos el 90% de nuestra producción y esa producción va toda por vía marítima. Lo que queda, el 10%, es el oro que va por avión. Pero bueno, el mar también es una fuente de riqueza que puede proveer en sus aguas, suelo, subsuelo, diferentes recursos. Pueden ser pesca, pueden ser los recursos minerales que están en los fondos. Y obviamente, y esto es lo más importante de nuestro punto de vista, que es un vasto escenario en que la mayor parte corresponde a aguas internacionales, que no se encuentran bajo la jurisdicción de un Estado. Esto, obviamente, en algunos casos nos lleva a ser aprovechado para desarrollar actividades ilícitas. Bien, ahora vemos qué cosa era lo que sería la OMI. Obviamente siempre se quiso tener regulaciones internacionales que fueran comunes a todas. ¿Por qué? Porque la mayor parte, como hemos dicho, de las aguas son aguas internacionales y tenía que haber una organización que las uniera y generara todas estas regulaciones que hay en estos momentos en el mar. Lamentablemente, obviamente empezaron en mediados del siglo XIX y lamentablemente hubo una serie de inconvenientes. Y básicamente es porque se quería que hubiera un organismo internacional permanente para promover la seguridad marítima de la forma más eficaz. Pero lamentablemente no se hizo. Ustedes creen haber visto esto, es los versos de Thomas Gray. Ya el año 1867, Thomas Gray, no el poeta, sino el jefe de la autoridad marítima inglesa, generó las reglas del camino y fueron varios estos versos de Thomas Gray. Pero ¿qué sucedió? Y eso fue el año 867, el año 878 hubo un gran accidente en el río Támesis. Era un buque de pasajeros que venía desde York a Londres y básicamente el 3 de septiembre del 78 colisionó con un buque que se llamaba el 𝒏𝒂𝒂 y simplemente el resultado de eso fueron la muerte de casi 700, 800 personas. No había pasajeros, no había lista de pasajeros y básicamente están estimadas la cantidad de muertos. Esto es una maqueta que está en el Museo Marítimo de Greenwich, cerca de Londres, y básicamente lo que sucedió fue que no solamente que se hundieron, sino que se hundieron en una zona que básicamente se emitía al mar cerca de 75.000 galones de aguas residuales. Fue un desastre muy muy grande y no hubo lamentablemente casos. En realidad sí hubo un comité legal y hubo cierta culpabilidad al buque carbonero, pero lamentablemente no se pudo ver la realidad porque el capitán del transbordador había fallecido. Pero finalmente esto, ¿qué sucedió? ¿Qué generó? Y esto generó, supongo que todos, la mayor parte de los que han estado alguna vez en un puente lo han visto, generó la emisión de un reglamento para prevenir abordajes. Y aquí se empieza a ver por qué la OMI está más o menos vista como un ente que es reactivo en vez de ser un ente proactivo. Pasaron los años y obviamente se quiso seguir esta cooperación de la cooperación internacional en transporte marítima, que tenían, obviamente había muchos buques que pasan por puertos extranjeros, otros se refugian en puertos por mal tiempo y acuden básicamente en ayuda de peligros. Entonces, a mediados del siglo XIX, se dio establecimiento a una serie de organizaciones en el mundo, como la Organización de Telégrafo, la Organización Meteorológica y la Unión Postal Universal. Pero lamentablemente en el año 1899 había una conferencia para desarrollar lo que era la OMI en ese momento en Washington y lamentablemente esto fue rechazado. ¿Y por qué fue rechazado? Porque básicamente por el momento no se considera conveniente el establecimiento de una Comisión Marítima Internacional. Y esto fue debido a que la industria era la que estaba sospechando que los países iban a emitir una serie de regulaciones que iban a limitar y restringir el comercio y la libertad de comercio internacional. Si bien esto era ya a fines del siglo XIX, luego viene un desastre que es notorio, que fue el Titanic, y esto fue el 14 al 15 de abril, básicamente chocó contra un iceberg y se hundió 40 minutos después. Los 40 minutos en realidad pensamos todos nosotros que puede ser factible un rescate bastante eficiente, pero lamentablemente no tenían los botes salvavidas y esto originó que fuera realmente un desastre. ¿Qué pasó? Que a raíz de este hundimiento del Titanic se generó el reglamento del SOLAS para la seguridad de la vida humana en el mar. Obviamente fue el año 2014, hubo un segundo reglamento el año 29, el año 48, el año 60 y actualmente está en vigencia el SOLAS del año 74. Así que no había pasado nada de esto. Finalmente ya en el año 45 ya establecidas las Naciones Unidas y obviamente empiezan ya las otras organizaciones amarradas y debajo de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas estaba la OASI de la aviación civil, la FAO para la industria alimentaria y la agricultura, la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para la Ciencia y la Cultura y la Organización Mundial de Salud. Todos eran básicamente miembros de las Naciones Unidas. Entonces, el año 48 se desarrolló una comisión, un comité para lograr desarrollar lo que era la OMI. Y básicamente se llevó a los siguientes propósitos de la convención. Y observen ustedes los detalles, ¿no? Básicamente es asuntos técnicos de todo tipo que afecten a la navegación dedicada al comercio internacional y fomentar la adopción de los estándares más altos posibles en asuntos relacionados con la seguridad marítima. Era lo único que había en ese momento. Habían habido grandes pérdidas en la Primera Guerra Mundial y en la Segunda Guerra Mundial me parece que fueron más de 6 millones de toneladas hundidas de buques mercantes. Y también aquí entró la industria a fomentar la eliminación de las medidas discriminatorias y restricciones innecesarias por parte de los gobiernos. La industria era muy, muy importante en estos momentos. Y obviamente era también la parte de disponer eliminar las prácticas restrictivas desleales por parte de las empresas de transporte marítimo y disponer la consideración de la organización cualquier otro asunto relacionado con el transporte marítimo que pueda darle y serle remitido por cualquier órgano o organismo de las Naciones Unidas y disponer obviamente los intercambios de información dentro de la organización. Aquí estaban ya parte de la seguridad de la vida humana en el mar, pero no había nada relacionado con el medio ambiente o con prevenir la contaminación. Y obviamente, ¿qué sucede? Vino el desastre del Torrey Canyon, un petrolero de los más grandes en ese momento que se hundió en básicamente cerca de las costas inglesas, en las islas de Chile, y obviamente derramó casi de medio millón a 705.000 barriles de petróleo. Y obvio, estos fueron en el canal inglés o en el canal de la Mancha, y vean ustedes, llegó a, y esta es la Mancha, y cómo va y embarró todas las costas de Inglaterra en el sur y las costas de Francia en el norte de Francia, y así fueron corriendo. Obviamente la Fuerza Aérea Inglesa bombardeó el derrame para tratar de que se quemara, pero lamentablemente fueron grandes las pérdidas que se desarrollaron. Aquí tienen ustedes, pueden ver las partes donde fueron las partes más involucradas, en las costas de Cornwall y las costas de Guernsey, en las islas del Canal, y en esta parte de Britania en Francia. Y esto ¿a qué llevó? Llevó obviamente al MARPOL, y ese es básicamente el reglamento de prevención de la contaminación en el mar, que nuevamente se estaba generando como una organización nuevamente reactiva a los hechos que estaban antes. Claro que ahora ven esta es la última versión del MARPOL, y acá no ven nada de petróleo, no ven nada de agua no ven nada en el mar, simplemente ven plásticos. O sea, cada vez más se está empezando a trabajar sobre lo que está en el momento. Pero finalmente la organización quedó con estas normas, quedó con este propósito, y es la agencia especializada de las Naciones Unidas, responsable de la seguridad y protección del transporte marítimo. Seguridad y protección del transporte marítimo incluye no solamente la carga, incluye el personal que está a bordo, y la prevención de la contaminación marina por los buques, sea tanto de derrames, sea tanto de petróleo botado al mar, sea tanto por la contaminación. De hecho, en estos momentos hay todo un movimiento para reducir las emisiones del transporte marítimo, y hay un compromiso para reducir más del 60% de estas emisiones para el año 2030. Dudo mucho ahora que se logre, pero vamos a ver si está esto en vigencia. Lamentablemente ha habido ahora un nuevo cambio de estrategia, la segunda parte de la estrategia después de los 5 primeros años, y no lo veo muy posible que puedan alcanzar estos objetivos. Finalmente, esto es la OMI, es la navegación segura, protegida y eficiente en mares limpios. Y esto es lo que resume básicamente lo que es la OMI. Pero, ¿qué aspectos afectan la seguridad? Y veremos cómo afecta al comercio marítimo. Bien, el comercio marítimo son más de 11.000 millones de toneladas de carga. Básicamente ustedes ven la contaminación de contenedores, otra carga seca, los petróleos y aceites, y en la parte final, los mayores graneles, y abajo están los petróleos y los aceites. Esto definitivamente va a seguir cambiando, va a seguir creciendo en el futuro. Estas son las proyecciones que se tienen del año 2019 de Clarkson Research, y realmente fíjense ustedes que la parte de lo que son Bueno, otra carga y los que son los contenedores van a crecer. La parte de la carga de a graneles, como son los minerales y otros, van a mantenerse. Y sí, ven ustedes que van a empezar a reducirse los petróleos crudos, los petróleos pesados. Básicamente son casi 93.500 buques con 1.8 millones de toneladas, y la cantidad de tripulantes que están involucrados son 1.647.000, de los cuales 774.000 son oficiales y 873.500 más o menos son subalternos de diferentes categorías. Y esto es lo que se puede ver en un día cualquiera con las posiciones de los AIS. Fíjense ustedes cómo están ya marcadas las rutas de todo el comercio. Y obviamente aquí ya tienen el estrecho de Malaca, obviamente el Golfo Pérsico y el Canal de Suez, la ruta del Mediterráneo y todas las rutas que van a Europa. Fíjense también que aquí no hay nada, porque claro, de aquí a China es más o menos simple ver, no hay, simplemente de aquí salen del Callao a China o de China al Callao, pero no hay una ruta establecida. Aquí sí, todas las rutas están básicamente marcadas en el AIS. Y lo que va a llevar esto a cabo es la piratería y robo armado. Esta es básicamente la definición de piratería, está en el artículo 101 de la Convención de las Naciones Unidas sobre el Derecho del Mar, y se refiere a lo que son las actividades ilegales cometidas en aguas internacionales. Es todo acto ilegal de violencia y detención de acto de depredación cometidos con un propósito personal por la tripulación o los pasajeros de un buque privado contra una nave en alta mar, o contra un buque o aeronave o personas en un lugar que no está sometido a ninguna jurisdicción del Estado. Esto simplemente se refiere a llevarse en aguas internacionales. Y la otra parte es la parte de la piratería, y el otro es el robo armado. Y el robo armado es exactamente lo mismo, simplemente es en aguas jurisdiccionales de cada uno de los estados. ¿Sabes? Las dos cosas son exactamente lo mismo, y para efectos de la industria es exactamente lo mismo. La piratería en aguas internacionales o el robo armado en las aguas nacionales. Obviamente todos han visto esto, eran los piratas somalíes. En esto hubo muchos esfuerzos internacionales, y un caso muy emblemático ha sido que fue el primer caso después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial en la que 5 miembros permanentes del Consejo de Seguridad de la ONU desplegaron fuerzas con propósitos similares. Ha sido la primera vez. Antes obviamente la desplegaron en bandos opuestos, pero esta fue la primera vez que generó. Aquí la OMI generó el Código de Conducta de Djibouti, que lo vamos a ver después. Pero también hubo una serie de operaciones internacionales que fueron en función de estas resoluciones de las Naciones Unidas, y son las cuales están vigentes hasta este momento en la zona del Golfo Pérsico, en la zona del Golfo, en el Cuerno de África, y etcétera, etcétera. Esto tuvo un impacto inmediato porque si ven ustedes aquí son gráficas de las líneas marítimas. Aquí está Somalia y ven ustedes cómo estaban alejadas. Finalmente, en función de estas operaciones, ya se fueron cada vez más acercándose a la costa y evitar esta ruta más grande por la parte superior. Pero esto fue ya gracias a estas operaciones militares. Obviamente también cambió la industria, y la industria cambió y hubo una serie de operaciones, una serie de medidas que las emplearon en cada uno de estos buques. Por ejemplo, los cañones a presión de agua, algunos buques llegaron a tener estos generadores de audio a alta frecuencia, sí tienen ahora casi todos estas zonas seguras con radios a bordo, rayos láser, guardias armados, que ese es un tema que todavía está en discusión. La OMI no promueve que hayan guardias armados a bordo. Sin embargo, esto es un tema muy común ahora si están navegando por el Golfo de Guinea o si están navegando por el Cuerno de África. Realmente, simplemente las concertinas de alambre púas, unas trampas para las hélices de los botes, cortinas de agua y un lubricantes en la cubierta para evitar que se los resbalen. Entonces, fíjense ustedes que realmente fueron cambiando. Aquí tienen los cañones de agua, las concertinas de aceite, alambre púas, los guardias armados y algunos que empezaron a crear, van a meter fuego contra fuego. Entonces, esto se llevó a cabo y realmente sí hubo en el Cuerno de África un cambio radical. Fíjense ustedes cómo en 2011-2012 que empiezan a operar estas fuerzas, ya las caen notablemente en forma de caen notablemente los ataques. Ahora bien, esto generó, y esto lo hizo la industria, no lo hizo la OMI, empezó a generarse estas áreas para comunicaciones, voluntarias, y estas eran las áreas de alto riesgo. En el año 2015 y en el año 2018 empezó a reclamar Oman y cambiaron esto al 2019. Ya en enero del 2023 esto ya dejó de tener vigencia, es decir, ya están considerando la industria que las rutas frente a las costas de Somalia son más o menos vigentes, son más o menos normales. Pero obviamente han habido todavía algunos ataques posteriores, ha habido en el año 2018 y el año 2019, pero fíjense ustedes que ya no eran frente a las costas de Somalia, eran a 340 millas o a 280 millas. O sea, ya los pescadores, los piratas tenían capacidad para ir mucho más de aquellos que iban simplemente aquí al cerca de sus costas. Finalmente sí ha habido un reporte en el año 2023, pero fue un reporte fallido. Y como les dije yo, la industria no diferencia entre piratería y robo armado. Para la industria es absolutamente lo mismo. O sea, son piratas o son robo armados. Aquí en el Callao tenemos un problema serio, pero aquí suben por la cadena y le roban a uno en un pañol unas latas de pintura. Es exactamente lo mismo que hayan secuestrado a la dotación de un buque en el Golfo de Guinea. ¿Qué ha hecho la OMI al respecto? Básicamente ha tenido una serie siempre la tiene permanentemente en la agenda. La última reunión ha sido en marzo del año 2023 y obviamente fueron estos 131 sucesos de piratería, tanto perpetrados como fallidos, y ha sido una reducción porque en el año 21 hubieron 172 sucesos. Y básicamente están ahí, ustedes tienen dónde fueron estos casos. La mayor cantidad fueron en Malaca y Singapur, en África Occidental, es decir, en el Golfo de Guinea 21, en América, en el Pacífico Sur 14, en el Océano Índico 9, en América el Atlántico 6, en el Caribe 4, en el Mar Meridional de la China 4 y en el Mar Arábico 1. ¿No? Y bueno, en el 2022 hubo en el Golfo de Guinea, que es el otro lugar que está ahora generando piratería, hubo 17 casos menos que en el 2021. ¿No? aquí están básicamente las zonas donde hay más piratería a bordo. Piratería ahora en este momento es en el estrecho de Malaca, pero tomen en cuenta que por ahí, en esta zona, por la zona del estrecho de Malaca, pasa normalmente casi el 25% del petróleo del mundo, diariamente. Ahí en esa zona ha habido un esfuerzo y un acuerdo de cooperación regional en combatir a la piratería y el robo armado. Fue el RICAP del año 2009 y fueron 15 países que están involucrados en este asunto. También tiene, obviamente, el centro es en la estación naval de Changi en Singapur, y la misión es cooperación internacional a través de intercambio de información. Otro punto que está ahora en este momento es en el Golfo de Guinea. Básicamente es Nigeria, que tiene un serio problema interior, porque aquí algunas petroleras han contaminado los ríos que van hacia el mar y hay una serie de reclamos por parte de ellos. Y ellos son los mismos que están actualmente pirateando los buques que salen de esta zona. Y obviamente con esto la OMI promovió la forma de los códigos, la firma del código de conducta relativa a la presión de los actos de piratería, y fueron 25 países que se comprometieron también a la implementación también de un MOU desarrollado por la OMI con las agencias de la Organización Marítima de África Occidental y África Central. Y esto aquí obviamente están todos los países involucrados para tratar de contrarrestar la piratería en esta zona. Y también la OMI trabaja con estrecha cooperación con las contra las entidades que son contra la piratería, y está también Interpol, la Organización Mundial de Aduanas y algunos socios como Japón, Francia, el Comando de África de los Estados Unidos, China, el Reino Unido, la Unión Europea, Noruega y los amigos del Golfo de Guinea del grupo del G8. Y obviamente lo más importante aquí, y eso es lo que ha tratado de hacer la OMI, es que los Estados miembros establezcan una legislación nacional para tipificar como delito la piratería y los ataques contra buques y otras actividades marítimas ilícitas. Nadie lo tenía en sus códigos penales. Obviamente también coordinar estructuras y procedimientos para controlar con personal operativo, técnico y logístico bien capacitado. Los países africanos tenían, cuando viene la descolonización después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, los países africanos solamente tenían ejércitos, no habían embarcaciones que hicieran la versión de o la Marina o la versión de la Guardia Costera, porque simplemente eso los hacían las potencias que tenían las colonias a su cargo, y no los países. Por eso lo que se está tratando ahora de hacer es lograr que hayan más personal capacitado para contrarrestar esto. Otro de los aspectos que involucran son los transportes, trasvases y descargas ilegales. Aquí, por ejemplo, tienen ustedes una imagen es frente a Corea del Norte. Corea del Norte tiene un embargo sobre diferentes lubricantes y combustibles que están prohibidos, y aquí encontraron esto fue en un MSC, en la reunión 100 del Comité de Seguridad Marítima. Esta es una embarcación panameña y esta es una pequeña embarcación norcoreana, y estaban llevando a cabo este trasvase ilegal. Obviamente con la falsificación de documentos, alteración de ellos y también la desactivación de los sistemas de localización, como es el GPS y el AIS. Ahora bien, con la guerra de Corea ha habido países que han, no boicoteado, quieren evitar que llegue petróleo ruso a Europa, pero el problema es que, fíjense, ha habido una serie de países, y ha sido China en realidad los que más ha aprovechado de esto, que ha empezado a comprar petroleros pequeños para poder llevar los buques hacia, para transferir el petróleo ruso a buques chicos y van luego a Asia. Pero no solamente buques chicos, ha habido una inversión de casi 376 millones de dólares y han comprado 7, 8 buques, son bastante grandes. Fíjense ustedes, estos son los buques. Y hay buques que tienen 100.000 toneladas, hay 3 buques de 100.000 o 106.000 toneladas, uno de 110.000, 2 de 110.000, uno de 150.000 toneladas y otros que están bordeando los 300 y hasta 320.000 toneladas. ¿Y esto dónde se lleva? Se llevan a cabo, ¿dónde llevan a cabo estos trasvases? Se llevan a cabo frente a Portugal y la costa de Portugal y España en el Atlántico y también frente a Grecia en el Mediterráneo. Ahora, obviamente, aquí hubo un problema porque se le declaró ilegal y Rusia reclamó esto en la OMI, diciendo que las transferencias ilegales de un barco a otro no, son ilícitas, que era lo que hizo la OMI, diciendo que se equiparara injustamente con las actividades de aquellas que involucran al comercio no regulado de la pesca y la vida silvestre. Obviamente, a la OMI analizó la creciente práctica de transferencias ilícitas, el alto riesgo que son inseguras de barco a barco, han proliferado frente a Grecia y España, ¿no? Y el número de buques es impresionante, son 300 a 600 petroleros que están involucrados dentro de estas sanciones. Y esto lamentablemente sigue vigente. Ya como fuente de recursos, como fuente de recursos, la pesca ilegal no declarada y no reglamentada, ahora ya básicamente en lo que es pesca a nivel mundial ya hemos llegado desde el año más o menos el año 85 a un estándar de pesca. Ya no se puede pescar más. La parte que sube es la acuicultura, pero fíjense aquí, del año 85 con las anomalías de temperatura en los océanos, básicamente casi es la misma cantidad y ya no va a crecer. Son 59 millones de personas que viven de esto en casi 4.6 millones de embarcaciones. Y fíjense de esto, casi el 75% de estas embarcaciones se encuentran en la parte de Asia, donde está Indonesia, Malasia, Filipinas y demás. Solamente 2.8 millones cuentan con motor, quiere decir que casi 1.8 millones no tienen motor, y de estos 202.800.000, 86% son menores de 12 metros, es decir, son totalmente artesanales, y solamente el 2% son mayores de 24 metros. Esto involucra generalmente a casi 142.000 millones de dólares. Ahora bien, ¿qué cosa es la pesca ilegal no declarada y no reglamentada? Y esa es la pesca ilegal, es la que es efectuada en las aguas bajo jurisdicción de un Estado sin permiso de este, o realizada por buques de Estados que son parte de una organización regional que faenan contraviniendo las medidas de conservación y ordenación adoptadas. Esto es pesca ilegal. La pesca no declarada, no reglamentada, se refiere, la pesca no declarada es la que no ha sido declarada de un modo exacto o se declara mucho menos, es decir, no, yo pesco 1.000 toneladas y declaro 500 o 300 toneladas, y eso está llevando a depredar lo que se genera. Aquí están, obviamente, los puntos ilegales en la zona del Océano Índico y en la zona del Estrecho de Malaca. Y la pesca no reglamentada es aquella que se hace en la zona de aplicación de una organización regional, pero por buques sin nacionalidad o que un Estado no es parte de esa organización. Perdón. Aquí ustedes ven lo que hace la Marina Indonesia cuando captura uno de estos buques haciendo pesca ilegal, no declarada y no reglamentada. Simplemente los vuela. O sea, no como nosotros que tenemos que venir, un fiscal lo interviene y lo deja al frente del buque, frente a un puerto, no. Simplemente ellos definitivamente ya lo vuelan y ya van a reclamar después no sé a quién. Obviamente, cerca de 26 millones de toneladas es lo que es pescado ilegalmente a nivel mundial. 20% del total pescado capturado. Y obviamente afecta a todo el mundo porque esto está relacionado con otros delitos como el lavado de dinero, hay secuestro de personal, hay asesinatos al personal. Y obviamente ya en el año 1995 se declaró un código de conducta de la pesca, control de conducta contra la pesca responsable. Fíjense ustedes, este diagrama lo que hace ver en las partes del mundo qué pesca está sostenible y qué pesca no está sostenible. Y fíjense ustedes, aquí tenemos casi solamente el 33% de pesca sostenible y no, y aquí arriba también. Entonces, el Atlántico Norte, el Caribe y América del Sur es los puntos más complicados relacionado a la pesca ilegal. Pero ¿por qué es la pesca ilegal? ¿Por qué es tan rentable? Este pescado se llama la totó, es un pescado más o menos de 1,5 metros. Y estas son sus vejigas, las vejigas natatorias de este pescado. Y básicamente cada una de estas, el kilo de una de estas, están alrededor de $50.000. Y esto tiene otros aspectos más, esto es del Interpol, pero tiene otros aspectos más, porque esta jojoa tiene el mismo hábitat que unos delfines, los llamados las vaquitas, y en realidad cuando alcanzan las jojoas agarran también las vaquitas, y las vaquitas creo que hay menos de 100.000 menos de 100.000 que están vigentes, 100.000 son los que están actualmente como sobrevivientes. Y aquí están lo que se refiere a qué cosa es pescado ilegalmente. Y vean ustedes, aquí hay salmones, truchas, aquí están los langostinos, y por aquí están obviamente también los que aquí nos interesan a nosotros, los calamares y esos squids. ¿Qué hace la OMI al respecto? Finalmente, la OMI se basa que estos buques en realidad son buques que no están, son buques inseguros y que no cumplen los estándares. Además, emplean tipos de artes de pesca que son ilegales y que normalmente se quedan en el fondo marino o que arrastran todo lo que hay en el fondo marino. Y de aquí se ha reforzado lo que son las responsabilidades de los estados ribereños, los estados costeros, los estados rectores de puerto para combatir con estos pescos. Y obviamente dentro de esto están lo que no pueden entrar a nuestras costas, aquellos que incumplen estas legislaciones. Por ejemplo, nosotros ya no dejamos entrar a nuestras costas la flota pesquera de calamares de China. Hace un par de años no está en vigente. Ahora, vean ustedes, aquí hay un ejemplo muy simpático de un pesquero chino. Realmente acá supongo que va a haber algunos oficiales ingenieros, pero vean ustedes lo que es generar 503 días sin entrar a ningún puerto. O sea, el último puerto fue en Singapur y ha estado aquí, llegó a Ciudad del Cabo. Pero acá están, fíjense ustedes, frente a la costa de África, y aquí en los puntos rojos son los puntos que ha podido entregar pescado a unos reefers o a unos buques que captan el pescado y lo van llevando a otros países. Esto, obviamente, estos son los puntos que están más involucrados en lo que se refiere al transbordo del personal. Entonces, obviamente tenemos uno nosotros aquí frente a nuestras costas, aquí en el sur de Argentina, en la parte de África, cerca de Liberia, y obviamente en la parte de lo que es Rusia. Porque después de esto, estos son los buques, son los puertos más involucrados en esto se refiere, y son los puertos más visitados por los reefers, son estos buques congeladores. Fíjense, aquí está Vladivostok, que es el número 1, Montevideo, Murmansk, Busan, Abyan, etcétera, etcétera. El terrorismo también está preocupado por la OMI. Fíjense ustedes, en el estrecho de Hormuz, el año 2018, esto...
2018, these are ships, iron ships, and when England captured a ship, a vessel in the Gibraltar area, in the Gibraltar Channel, and the irons captured an English vessel in the Hormuz Channel, and this generate an exchange of or attacks against vessels that were on the United Emirates, and they generate a number of damage. So in 2019, 2020, the Brazilian Navy gave this presentation in the IMO. You can see the number of things that were polluted by fuel, more than 3,600 kilometers of Brazilian coast, and in their analysis, they determined that basically what has happened is that the oil spill was in this area, next to the communication lines. What was the country? Well, they didn't go farther, or they didn't say which one, but obviously it was a country in this area. And finally, they reached a conclusion. It was all of the hypotheses they had, and finally, there was a spill, a wrong transfer from a spill from ship to ship to transfer. Ecothermism, was that intentional or a tank wash? Difficult to be a tank wash because it was, but one of these two was the two main conclusions they achieved. What's terrorism? At the IMO, what we work with the code, with the PBIP code that was prepared at IMO because of or due to the Twin Towers attack in US, and then they issue this and include this to the PIP code, and this is basically against all of the vessels and port facilities. And also there has been a number of MUs regarding the suppression of illegal works and under the executive direction of the Committee Against Terrorism of the United Nations and the Working Group on the execution of the fight against terrorism. I have a couple more points very fast. Alterations to the environment or to the surrounding area. I mean, for example, the bridge on the Kerch channel in between Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, Putin wanted to link Guinea Crimea with Russia, but according to that, this reduced the size of the vessel that can move there. So it's basically 160 meters length, 33 meters width, and 8 meters depth. So as the Russian says, there is no area with no possibility of sailing of more than 8 meters, but this was attack. And we are looking forward to see what would happen with this. The final point is regarding the agreement on the Black Sea initiative on cereals, because from Russia, Ukraine, there are 30% of the exportation of maize, 20%, and 70% of the oil. And if this gave us access to the Russian fertilizers that were included in this agreement. What do I say that OMI participate here? Because the chief of the Fred Kenny is the chief, and he's not his ex-Coast Guard, and he's now the legal department chief of the IMO. So it was basically it was signed with Airline, with Antonio Gutierrez, with the Ministry of Defense of Russia, the Foreign Trade Ministry of Ukraine, but the one leading this was the IMO. So as you can see, the quantities of wheat, corn, sunflower meal, oil, sunflower oil, and others that were included and were exported. Obviously, this plan involved or aimed to get exportation out of 3 areas, and this is the road, the path that needed to be sailed by the vessels located there. Basically, the 3 Ukrainian ports, they went to one area and then moving through Istanbul, and then toward the Mediterranean Sea. What has happened? Why Russia doesn't want to continue with this agreement? Because unfortunately, this was canceled on July 17 this year, because Russia states that the cereals that were exported from this area, no more than 7% went to the poor countries. That was basically the purpose of this exporting path, but from Ukrainian. But obviously, with this, the Ukrainian production will be broken and avoid the export from Ukraine of this cereal. Okay. Some final conclusions. And the ocean or the sea will always be an important scenario for the interaction and development of humanity. The cooperation could be regional, multi-regional, or global, and will be relevant for the use of all maritime spaces and to fight all the illegal actions within it. The IMO will continue to be a technical space where future innovations will be discussed and agreements will be reached by consensus. We do not have votations at the IMO. Everything is agreed by consensus. And second, we are not a political or diplomatic entity. We are a technical center, basically. So this is it. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much, Admiral. I think both presentations have covered very good the understanding of our profession in the maritime area. In the first part, we were able to see, since the security and safety point of view, we have seen all that is involved in the maritime areas, and also, but sometimes it's important to think on where does the fish come from, what are the communication, the maritime communication ways or paths, what some things happen in certain areas, and we need to understand this with a description that has been given very good by our speaker, and also you all that are here by Mr. DeVille, and also you are here and virtually you have had the opportunity to understand what goes on the ocean, and understand that all the food, fuel, goods, all of them are moving around, are moved through the ocean, through the sea. And that's why it is important, our profession, to keep the maritime path open. Now we're going to start with question and answer period. Let's see if we have some questions from the audience.
Sí, la oficial de Holanda.
Buenas tardes por preparar y presentar estos dos temas. Tengo una pregunta. Yo soy de los Países Bajos y nuestra conexión con Latinoamericana es básicamente el principal puente, como mencionaste, para Europa, y mencionó la importancia de estas relaciones y cooperaciones entre Europa y Latinoamericana y también Estados Unidos para enfrentar los problemas ilegales. Entonces, ¿cómo interrumpir o disrumpir estos problemas y las iniciativas? ¿Cuáles serían las iniciativas, no solo del problema de tráfico, sino también ser más proactivos en la disrupción de estos problemas? Gracias. Sí, veo la oportunidad para iniciativas que podrían enfrentar estos problemas. Esa era la pregunta, ¿verdad? Y con la participación de Europa, sí hay iniciativas exitosas ya. El problema es que
in the area like yours, but that is not, it's all in a national sense, because they have overseas territories and they feel responsible for them, obviously, and that's why they have in their national maritime strategies, in their national doctrines, they consider the Latin American, their overseas territories as part of the responsible area of responsibility, obviously. But that is nothing which is actually transferred into a European initiative. So, and that's the problem. America is much more, North America is more proactive, but it's in their direct vicinity, right? So it's easier for them. Right now, I don't see a European initiative, a practical European initiative that actually supports or addresses the maritime security issues here in a practical manner, underpinning it with actually sending assets. That is something I actually don't see now, which is a missed opportunity in my opinion, actually.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Good morning. Good morning, Lieutenant Commander Marco Mujica. Thank you for all your speakers and thank you for your great presentation. My question is about to Mr. Peters about the maritime strategy around the South China Sea among the interactions between the artificial island with the red fishing vessels. So, Mr. Peters, what is your opinion about the ambiguity strategy? We talk about CCP or PRC strategy using hybrid warfare around the gray zone, economic warfare, we talk about cognitive warfare, law warfare, and non-kinetic operations. So in this point of view, we know that PRC tried to use strategic coercions without war. What is your opinion about this kind of ambiguity of strategy that don't have a one meaning, have a different meaning, interpretations for all the other countries? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. So you were asking about the use of gray zone tactics by China for in particular, and how to tackle them, right?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Yes, they do use it, of course, and it is a problem because gray zone tactics are always hard to tackle. Because how would you do it? That's you need a comprehensive approach for it, and who is affected actually. So using gray zone tactics in the lawfare is a good example. Using lawfare in the South China Sea. Lawfare in the South China Sea is something which doesn't affect European states actually, because it's not an issue for European citizens, but it is an issue for Vietnamese fishermen, for example. So the approach Europe is actually doing is trying to strengthen multilateralism, trying to strengthen regional cooperation to actually enhance the states there to counter these gray zone activity more in a better way, actually. But we also see this kind of initiatives in Europe as well. Actually, in my profession, China has begun for researchers that actually do China critical research, they're trying to put them to court, not because they actually want them to be charged, but to impose the risks of the jurisdiction, the whole legal process, the whole court process on these researchers. And normally there is no insurance for that. The host institutions are unable to cover that. And what they do, they offer you an agreement saying, okay, well, we won't go to court, but you have to sign an agreement that you stop kind of doing the research the way you do it. So that is kind of lawfare we actually experiencing in Europe and in North America as well in regard of China. And that's pretty hard to tackle. I think one of the things that is actually quite one aspect of countering gray zone activities is actually naming and shaming. Naming and shaming is an easy way. It doesn't cost anything, but it imposes the cost for China, because the more often China has to like find some way of arguing against it, the harder it actually gets to keep on with this narrative. So that's one aspect, being more proactive and actually blaming China for the things they do and forcing them to actually declare themselves why they do it. And to create more awareness for it. That is something which Germany in particular wasn't really bad at, right? And when the Ukraine war broke out, then from one day to another, German politicians said, there will be cyber attacks, so we have to be prepared for that. But that was it, basically. What was basically one announcement saying, okay, now our duty is done. And that's not the thing to actually deal with such threats. You have to create more awareness, and you have to be constantly pointing your finger at it. That's one thing that can easily be done, and quite fast actually. Other aspects are when you go to legal institutions and stuff like that. That just takes a long time. That's not the most easy way to do, but I think that's one aspect of countering it. And we definitely experience this kind of gray zone tactics. Yeah.
Yo tengo una pregunta para el almirante Deville. Usted bien ha presentado todas las amenazas, los retos que tenemos en las áreas marítimas relacionados con las vías de comunicación, la contaminación, el flujo, la pesca ilegal y todos esos
answers and challenge are based mainly in cooperation, in exchange of information. So in the last years, we have even created the fusion centers. You have seen the evolution during the last years because many countries were not very open to share information. So what do you think? How do you see the evolution in the last year, and what is your opinion about the future? Well, really, the first center of information, of diffusion and information, was the one generated by Singapore Army in the Changi Navy base in Singapore. Really, after that, they start to work with the Center of Information in Africa, and here we have created an information center involving the Pacific area. So it's really a very important point for contributing. With no operation, we won't have any output. In order to face and battle this cooperation, and in the ocean, in the sea, we are all. Or let's say it's very difficult to fight against someone who will be in the CEE area, or in the economic exclusive zone of a country, in the EEZ. So they are vessels that are in the external area from our areas that try to go back and forth. So I think that is important. I forgot a sentence from Nelson Mandela that said, if you want your enemy to become a friend, start to work with him, and you will see how the information start to flow. Okay, we have, this is the end of our symposium. I will give the floor to our presentators. We invite Rear Admiral Luis Ercarpios, Director of the Naval School, for the closing words. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed and that it has been very useful for all of you. The General our commander, General Commander of the Navy, it clearly explained how we start with this effort to organize this type of event. And I think that the most important that we have to highlight here is that we are planting seeds for the future. Most of us that are here, we decided to serve our country in the navies and in our army forces, and nobody forces us. But I believe that after today's presentation, it is really clear how important is our profession. We are women and men devoted to protect the interests of our countries, and to contribute to the worldwide safety and security. So we need to understand that our profession demands not just the manage and the mastering of our vessels, but also the deeply understanding of what's going on in the sea and the importance of the sea in the economical activities and in the life of people. So this conference is carried out every year. Every 3 years we have a special edition. Last year we had the opportunity to organize exclusively for highlighting the role of women in the armies. This year we have focused on this topic to try to understand the future of the security and defense before current scenarios and conflict. We have been able to see that it's important to have definitions, and this was explained by Ms. Heuser, but everything is based on understanding the definitions and how we react or plan operations according to what we believe we see in front of our reality. It's very important also, as far as I'm concerned, and also the General Chiaperini explained it very good, what we are facing today. Through his words, we were able to see what was the strategy and the means of use, and he has explained us very carefully what is going on with the new technologies and the use of them, and what makes a small country to face or to fight a bigger country, and their operations that are very interesting to analyze, that are showing us that we have complicated challenge for the future. Johannes Peters has explained us and given us a very good presentation from the European point of view, how Europe see the challenge, and we see that Germany is even starting to deploy vessels up to Asia. In 2014 was the first time that Germany frigate went to this area after 20 years. After 20 years that German vessels sailed those waters. But the interesting thing is about why? Because 40% of the traffic in that area is the one that reach Europe. So we have seen the importance of the maritime road. And finally, Vice Admiral De Ville has given us a very important explanation of the IMO to understand how it works, to understand what is behind, to understand each of the challenges that we have. I want again to thank the senior management and officers for the trust, to the Naval Academy for this opportunity, to the Pacific Academy with the surface force and with the infantry force that has allowed our attendees to have this experience that I expect to be unforgettable for you, that has been able to be on the 𝒂𝒏𝒕𝒆 and also in the infantry base located in Ancon, to the National Hydrography Direction that has allowed us to visit the Carrasco vessel, that is the oceanographic vessel, one of the most modern, and that we have sent it to the Antarctic, and it was really for us. The Pisco is we feel very proud of Pisco because it was built here, and the Carrasco is also we are proud of it also because it has the a state-of-art technology, the marine infantry, also with all the capacity. You were able to visit the CIMA, that is the industrial capacity of vessel construction in our Navy, where we have built not just the 2 vessels that I have just mentioned, but also the VIP Union vessel that is currently sailing and it's sailing into that right now. It's in Asia. I want to thank NAURSTIF too, because they have allowed us to have Mrs. Heuser, Admiral Caperini, and Mr. Magister Johannes Peters. So they also, Miss Heuser was able to visit the Army school. So it's a proof that we are working together for the benefit of Peru. And also I want to thank Admiral 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒄𝒊𝒂𝒅, my colleague, for welcoming us in the school with the academy, and we have been working together for renovating this place and for having you together with us. So I want to thank all of the officers and all of the attendees from the Navy Academy, and I want to thank personally my team, the officers and all the officers and all the personnel of the Navy School, the Superior Navy School, that has been working very hard for several months for being able to achieve this event, especially Commander Binatea, who is our right arm for the coordination of all of the events. At the end, the junior officers from other countries were able to have been able to experiment not just the marine life but also some Peruvian culture. So we really thank you for the effort. I want to thank something that we need to remember always. When we are prepared in our work courses, we are always told and learn about the space, time, and force. And I want to thank, because the 4 speakers today have done a big effort coming here, a big distance, long distance. They have separate time to share with us their knowledge, and they are here in this space, and the academic space is very important. So to the officers also that are here, I want to thank you, because we have stopped your works in your own countries to come here to Peru and represent your armies, your marines, but also to share experiences, to make friends, and to keep, I hope, this link that you have just started here in Peru lasting for many years. To the officers coming from all the agencies, and to our students, alumni from the Superior Naval Academy, my recognition for being here, for sharing time with us, and also to all the students that are here. We have also the attendance of our faculty from the War Navy and former students from the 𝒍𝒐𝒔. That is a course that we provide to promote the defense concept. So for all people involved in this symposium, thank you so much. And we're going to conclude. I close the 10th Symposium of Officers of the New Generation of the Americas. Thank you so much.
El presente Foro Internacional.
So this international forum has finished. Thank you.
Invito a los señores.
I invite all of you to stand up. We kindly invite the faculties, attendants, and speakers to the cryptic area for the official picture. To all our international delegates and the attendees. So Rear Admiral Luis del Carpio, Director of the Navy School, is leaving together with the Counter-Rear Director of the Naval Academy.
La Marina de Guerra.
The Peruvian Army, Navy, thank you for your attendance. Those that are here in person, and thank also for those that have attended virtually. Thank you and good afternoon.
Lights go out and I can't be saved.